Hi, I'm Walter Sennett Armstrong from Duke University.
And I'm Ram Netta from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill.
3 years ago, Ram and I constructed a Coursera course called Think Again. It taught students how to analyze and evaluate arguments.
It taught them how to tell the difference between good reasoning and bad reasoning.
Over the last 3 years, we've had a wonderful time teaching Think Again, and we've really enjoyed interacting in the discussion forums with students from all over the world.
We were extremely pleased with the reaction to our course. Over the past 3 years, over 750,000 students enrolled in that course.
But we realized that we could teach the course even more effectively if we made a few small changes.
First, it wasn't easy to cover all the material that we wanted to cover in the 12 weeks of our course. Each week contained hours of lecture, exercises, and quizzes. And doing all those hours of work every week for 12 weeks was a tall order.
In the third week of each section of that old course, we asked you to learn new material and then also take a quiz. Well, that's just too much.
So for these reasons, we decided that the best way for students to learn all of the material that we wanted to teach them was to divide up our original course into 4 much shorter courses.
That way, you can take one of the courses, take off a month or 2, take another course, maybe skip a course, we hope you won't, but do it at your own pace in the way that fits your lifestyle best.
And that way, you're most likely to end up learning all of the material that we want you to learn. Maybe not this year, but eventually.
And the material really does fit together. So even though we've split up the course into 4 separate courses, it's very worthwhile for you to take all the different courses if you possibly can.
The lectures in the mini course that you're about to take now were all part of our original 12-week course. And so frequently, you're going to find that we make references in those lectures to other features of that original 12-week course.
For example, very early on, I say that arguments have a form or a structure, and that we'll study that form or structure in future weeks in the course. Well, now that's in the second course, the course on deductive logic.
And I begin the course in deductive logic by saying, "Welcome to Unit 2 of our course." Well, I was referring to Unit 2 of our original 12-week course. But now, deductive logic is its own course. And when I talk about weeks 4 and 5, I'm referring to weeks 4 and 5 of our original 12-week course. But now, they're weeks 1 and 2 of the deductive logic course.
We hope this is not too confusing, but the basic message is really simple. Just ignore all of those cross-references to other parts of courses or other courses, just the same way that you ignore the wrinkles on an old road map.
Hey, I like to use wrinkled road maps.
Well, it's fine to use wrinkled road maps as long as you know the wrinkles aren't extra roads, because then you're going to drive off onto them.
So you're saying that the students can learn all the material that we want to teach them, even if they ignore all of our references to the old 12-week course?
Exactly.
Sounds like a plan to me.
We hope that you enjoy taking this mini course just as much as we enjoyed making it.
And we hope that it encourages you to take the other courses in our Think Again sequence.
And also to encourage your friends and family to take this series of courses as well, because it's a lot more fun to take these courses together with other people so that you can talk to them about the arguments you'll be studying.
Thank you for listening.
Welcome to the second unit of our course. In the first unit of the course, you learned how to listen to what someone was saying or read what they wrote and separate out the arguments that they were giving from the rest of their words. You learned what arguments are, what their parts are, and how those parts work together to achieve the various purposes of argument. Now, in this second unit of the course, and the third unit that follows it, you'll learn some rules for evaluating the success of arguments. In particular, in the second unit of the course, we'll focus on rules for evaluating the validity of deductive arguments. And then in the third unit of the course, we'll focus on rules for evaluating the strength of inductive arguments. Recall that deductive arguments are arguments that are presented as being valid, and they're successful only if they're valid. Inductive arguments, in contrast, are arguments that are not presented as being valid. They're presented as being strong, and they're successful only to the extent that they are strong. Okay, now since in this second unit of the course we're focusing on rules for evaluating the validity of deductive arguments, let me say a bit more now about validity and about the rules for assessing validity. See, I just got a new pet clownfish, Nemo. Now, maybe you don't know much about clownfish anatomy, but I'm going to try to persuade you right now that clownfish have gills. Here's an argument that I could give you for the conclusion that clownfish have gills. Well, catfish have gills, and goldfish have gills, and sharks have gills. Therefore, clownfish have gills. Now, is that argument valid? No, it's not. It's not valid because it's possible for the premises to be true even when the conclusion is false. It could be that catfish and sharks and goldfish all have gills, even though clownfish don't. But now suppose I give you a different argument for the conclusion that clownfish have gills. Here's how this different argument goes. All fish have gills. Clownfish are a kind of fish. Therefore, clownfish have gills. Now that argument is valid. There's no possible way for the premises of that argument to be true if the conclusion is false. Recall that in the first unit of the course, Walter defined validity as follows. He said an argument is valid if there's no possible way for all the premises of that argument to be true while the conclusion is false. And he gave an example of an argument that was valid. The example, recall, went like this. Premise 1. Mary has a child who is pregnant. Premise 2. Only daughters can become pregnant. Therefore, conclusion, Mary has at least one daughter. Now remember, as Walter pointed out, you can imagine situations where the first premise is false. Maybe Mary doesn't have a child who is pregnant. You can imagine situations in which the second premise is false. Maybe not only daughters can become pregnant. Maybe there's some way for sons to become pregnant, or maybe there's some way for children of some third gender or some unspecified gender to become pregnant. And you can imagine a situation in which the conclusion is false, in which Mary doesn't have at least one daughter. But what you can't imagine, what's completely incoherent, what's completely impossible, is for there to be a situation in which both of the premises are true and the conclusion is false. In any possible situation, either the premises are, in any possible situation in which the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. There's no possible situation for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. So, that's what makes that argument valid. Now, what I'd like to do right now is show that there are other arguments that have the same form as this first argument about Mary and are valid for what seems to be the same reason as the argument about Mary is valid, even though they have a completely different subject matter. So here's another example. Consider the following argument. Premise 1. Terry has a job in which she arrests people. Premise 2. Only police officers can arrest people, and therefore, conclusion, at least one of Terry's jobs is as a police officer. Now again, maybe premise one of this argument is false. You can certainly imagine that it's false, right? Maybe Terry doesn't have a job in which she arrests people. Maybe premise two of the argument is false. You can imagine a situation in which not only police officers can arrest people. Maybe there's a world in which police officers and judges and plumbers and actors can all arrest people. And of course, you could imagine a situation in which the conclusion is false, in which it's not true that at least one of Terry's jobs is as a police officer. But what you can't imagine, what's completely impossible, is that both of the premises of that argument are true and the conclusion is false. If both of the premises of that argument about Terry are true, the conclusion has to be true. And so the argument is valid. The argument about Terry is valid, just as the argument about Mary is valid. Now notice, the two arguments have completely different subject matters. The first is about Mary's children, the second is about Terry's jobs. But even though they have completely different subject matters, they have something in common. There seems to be something in common to their form, something signaled by their use of the terms only and at least. Something in common to the two arguments that explains why they're valid. To get at what this common feature is a bit more clearly, let me give a third and final example of this form. Let's see if you get the idea. So consider the following argument. Premise 1. Robert has a pet who is canine. Premise 2. Only mammals can be canine. So, conclusion, Robert has at least one pet who is mammal. Now, of course, you can imagine a situation in which premise 1 is false. Maybe Robert doesn't have any canine pets. You can imagine a situation in which premise 2 is false, in which not only mammals are canines, maybe some canines are reptiles, or some canines are robots, or who knows. And of course, you can imagine a situation in which the conclusion is false, and in which Robert doesn't have any mammal pets. Maybe all of his pets are birds or reptiles, or maybe he doesn't have any pets. But in any case, you can imagine these possibilities, but what you cannot imagine, what's completely ruled out, is the possibility that the premises of that argument are true and the conclusion is false. If the premises of the argument are true, the conclusion has got to be true. And so this argument about Robert is also valid, just like the arguments about Mary and Terry were valid. But of course, this argument about Robert has a completely different subject matter than the arguments about Mary or Terry, right? One was an argument about Mary's children, the other was an argument about Terry's jobs, and this is an argument about Robert's pets. Completely different subject matters, but they're all valid, and it seems they're all valid for the same reason. They have the same form, and it's a form that's signaled by their use of the phrases only and at least. So, what we'll be doing in the second unit of the course is studying the forms of valid argument, the forms that explain why valid arguments are valid. Now, in the arguments that we just looked at, the arguments about Mary, Terry, and Robert, their common form, I said, involved the use of the word only, and it also involved the use of the phrase at least. Now, only and at least are both phrases that we're going to call quantifiers. And next week, in week 5 of the course, when we study the subject that we're going to call categorical logic, we're going to be studying, in particular, quantifiers like only, at least, some, all, none, and phrases like that. And we're going to be studying how the use of phrases like that, the use of quantifiers, can make arguments valid no matter what those arguments are about. If the arguments use quantifiers like only, at least, some, all, and none in certain ways, then those arguments are going to be valid regardless of their subject matter. But this week, in week 4, we're not going to be studying quantifiers like only or at least. Instead, we're going to be studying a kind of phrase that we're going to call a propositional connective. In particular, a kind of propositional connective that we'll call a truth functional connective. So, what are propositional connectives? What are truth functional connectives? How do they work to make arguments valid? Those questions and more we'll address in the next lecture. This week we're going to be studying propositional logic, which is the rules that determine the validity of an argument based on the propositional connectives that are used in that argument. Now, I've said a little bit about propositional connectives, but in order to say more about what propositional connectives are, in particular in order to give a definition of propositional connectives, I have to start out by giving a definition of propositions. So, what are propositions? A proposition is the kind of thing that can be true or false, and that can be the premise or the conclusion of an argument. Let me give you some examples to illustrate that definition. See these binoculars? These binoculars are not a proposition. They can't be true or false, and they can't be the premise or the conclusion of an argument. See this hand? This hand is not a proposition. This hand cannot be true or false, and it can't be the premise or the conclusion of an argument. But now, suppose I say, the binoculars are in my hand. Now, what I just said, that the binoculars are in my hand, that is the kind of thing that can be true or false. For instance, right now it's true, and right now it's false. It's also the kind of thing that could be the premise or the conclusion of an argument. For instance, I could say, the binoculars are in my hand, therefore, my hand is not free to shake yours. Or I could say, you just gave me the binoculars and I haven't let go of them, therefore, the binoculars are in my hand. See? So that the binoculars are in my hand, that's a proposition. That's the kind of thing that can be true or false, and that can be the premise or the conclusion of an argument. Now that we know what propositions are, what's a propositional connective? A propositional connective is something that takes propositions and connects them to create new propositions. For instance, sometimes in English the word and can work as a propositional connective. So let me give you an example of how in English the word and can sometimes function as a propositional connective. So consider the proposition, I'm holding the binoculars. Right, that's a proposition. It's the kind of thing that can be true or false, and it's the kind of thing that can be the premise or the conclusion of an argument. Well, there's also the proposition, I'm looking through the binoculars. Right? That's the kind of thing that can be true or false, and it's the kind of thing that can be the premise or the conclusion of an argument. Well, you could use the word and to connect up those two propositions to make a new proposition. The new proposition would be, I am holding the binoculars and looking through them. See, now that's a proposition. It's the kind of thing that can be true or false, and it's also the kind of thing that could be the premise or the conclusion of an argument. For instance, right now it's true that I'm holding the binoculars and looking through them, whereas right now it's false that I'm holding the binoculars and looking through them. I could say, what you're seeing right now is really happening. Therefore, I'm holding the binoculars and looking through them. Or I could say, I'm holding the binoculars and looking through them. Therefore, I should not be driving a car right now. You see? So that I'm holding the binoculars and looking through them is also a proposition. It's the kind of thing that can be true or false, and it's the kind of thing that can be the premise or the conclusion of an argument. But it's a proposition that we created by combining two other propositions, namely the proposition I'm holding the binoculars and the proposition I'm looking through the binoculars, by combining those two propositions with the word and. So that's an example of how the word and in English can work as a propositional connective, connecting two propositions into a third proposition. Now, I just said that in English, the word and functions as a propositional connective. But it doesn't always function that way, even in English. For instance, think about a sentence that uses the word and, like the sentence, Jack and Jill finally talked. I can think of at least 3 different interpretations of that sentence, 3 different things that that sentence could mean. And corresponding to those 3 different things that the sentence could mean, 3 different ways that the word and is getting used in that sentence. So here's one thing the sentence could mean. Jack and Jill could be a name of a particular entity, like let's say a fast food company. There could be a fast food company called Jack and Jill. And maybe Jack and Jill, the fast food company, make some kind of special stew. And lawyers have been asking Jack and Jill to disclose the ingredients of this special stew because they find that a lot of the customers who eat this stew have been getting sick recently. So lawyers are asking Jack and Jill to disclose the ingredients, and Jack and Jill refuses to do so until finally the spokesperson for Jack and Jill holds a press conference in which she discloses the ingredients of the special stew. Okay, now I might describe that situation by saying Jack and Jill finally talked. But what I mean there is that there's a particular entity, namely the company, Jack and Jill, and that company finally talked through its spokesperson, finally disclosed the ingredients of its special stew through its spokesperson. Now, on that interpretation of the sentence, Jack and Jill finally talked, the word and is not being used as a propositional connective. It's not connecting 2 propositions and forming a larger proposition out of those 2 smaller propositions. Here's another way of understanding the sentence Jack and Jill finally talked. Let's suppose Jack, Jill, and Roger are having a silence contest to see who among the 3 of them can be silent the longest. And all 3 of them are silent for a long period of time, and you're calling in, while I'm watching the silence contest, you're calling in to me periodically to find out if any one of these 3 contestants finally talked. And finally, at one point, you call in and you say, okay, has anyone talked yet? And I say, well, Jack and Jill finally talked. So Roger won the competition. Now there in that sentence, when I say Jack and Jill finally talked, the word and is being used as a propositional connective. What I'm saying, in effect, is that Jack finally talked and Jill finally talked. So there are 2 propositions that I'm trying to communicate. The proposition Jack finally talked and the proposition Jill finally talked. And I'm using the word and to connect those 2 propositions into a larger proposition, Jack and Jill finally talked. And so Roger won the competition. There, the word and is being used as a propositional connective. It's just connecting the proposition Jack finally talked and the proposition Jill finally talked to form a larger proposition, Jack and Jill finally talked. Now there's a third way that the word and could get used, just in that sentence, Jack and Jill finally talked. Suppose Jack and Jill are a couple, and recently they've been having a tough time. They've been angry and resentful, and they haven't been talking to each other about the sources of their anger and resentment. Well, suppose they decide that they're going to finally get their grievances out into the open. They're going to talk to each other. Then I might say, Jack and Jill finally talked. Now there, when I use the word and, I'm not just connecting the proposition Jack finally talked and Jill finally talked. What I'm trying to communicate is not just that each of them talked. I'm trying to communicate that each of them talked to the other. I'm trying to say that they talked to each other. So there, in that third interpretation, the word and is not working just as a propositional connective. It's not just connecting the proposition that Jack finally talked and the proposition Jill finally talked, because I'm trying to get across something more than just that Jack finally talked and Jill finally talked. I'm also trying to get across the point that they talk to each other. Right? That's what I'm trying to communicate there with the sentence Jack and Jill finally talked. So there, the word and is not being used as a propositional connective. So I hope I've made it clear that the word and can get used in a bunch of different ways in English. One of the ways it can get used is as a propositional connective, to connect up 2 propositions into a larger proposition. But that's not the only way it can get used. It can get used in other ways as well, and I've tried to give examples of those just now. What we're going to be concerned about here is just the use of and as a propositional connective. And then we'll look at other expressions in English, like or, not, but, only, if, and so forth, that also get used as propositional connectives. We'll look at those and see how those work. Okay, so now let's consider the propositional connective and. Notice, though, that even when the word and is being used as a propositional connective, it can still get used in different ways. For instance, suppose I say, I took a shower and got dressed. Well, there, and is being used as a propositional connective. It's connecting two propositions, the proposition I took a shower and the proposition I got dressed. It's connecting those into a larger proposition, I took a shower and got dressed. But there, the word and is being used to convey a sense of temporal ordering, a sense of time. The idea is, when I say I took a shower and got dressed, the idea is I first took a shower and then got dressed. Right? It wouldn't mean the same thing if I said I got dressed and took a shower. But sometimes, when the word and is being used as a propositional connective, there's no suggestion of temporal ordering. So, for instance, if I say I'm holding the binoculars and looking through them, there's no suggestion that I'm doing one first and then the other. Right? I'm just doing both. I'm holding them and looking through them. There's no suggestion that one is happening before the other. Now, in that second usage, when the word and doesn't convey any kind of temporal ordering, where it just combines two propositions into a larger proposition without conveying any sense of temporal ordering, then I'll say the word and is not just functioning as a propositional connective, but it's functioning as what I'll call a truth functional connective. So what's a truth functional connective? A truth functional connective is a propositional connective that creates new propositions whose truth or falsity depends on nothing other than the truth or falsity of the propositions that went into creating them. Let me give you some examples to illustrate that definition. So consider, again, our example, Jack and Jill finally talked, where that's used to mean just that Jack finally talked and that Jill finally talked. Okay, so when is that proposition going to be true? When is it going to be true that Jack and Jill finally talked? Well, that's going to be true whenever it's true that Jack finally talked and Jill finally talked. As long as those two conditions are true, as long as Jack finally talked and Jill finally talked, it's also going to be true that Jack and Jill finally talked. So if it's not true that Jack finally talked, then it won't be true that Jack and Jill finally talked. If it's not true that Jill finally talked, then it won't be true that Jack and Jill finally talked. But as long as it is true that Jack finally talked and that Jill finally talked, it will be true that Jack and Jill finally talked. So that use of and is a use of and as a truth functional connective, because it creates a new proposition, Jack and Jill finally talked, the truth or falsity of which depends on nothing other than the truth or falsity of the two propositions that it connects. There are lots of other examples. So for instance, consider the use of and as a truth functional connective in the proposition, I'm holding the binoculars and looking through them. Again, when is that proposition going to be true? It's going to be true only in these cases where it's true that I'm holding my binoculars, and it's also true that I'm looking through my binoculars. If both of those are true, then the whole proposition, I'm holding my binoculars and looking through them, will also be true. If either one of those initial propositions is false, if it's false that I'm holding the binoculars, or if it's false that I'm looking through the binoculars, then the whole proposition, I'm holding the binoculars and looking through them, will also be false. So there again, the truth or falsity of the whole proposition depends on nothing other than the truth or falsity of the propositions that go into creating it, using the truth functional connective and. And that's what shows that "and" in that usage is a truth functional connective. It's that the proposition that it creates by joining other propositions is a proposition whose truth or falsity depends on nothing other than the truth or falsity of the ingredient propositions that went into creating it. That's a truth functional connective. Now, in week 4, this week on propositional logic, we're going to be studying truth functional connectives and how the use of truth functional connectives in argument can make those arguments valid no matter what those arguments are about. Now, let's move to some examples.
In the last lecture, we learned about the truth functional connective that we called conjunction. The truth functional connective that, in English at least, is sometimes expressed by certain uses of the word "and." And we learned about the truth table for conjunction. Now, one thing I'd like to do in today's lecture is show how we can use the truth table for conjunction to show that certain kinds of inferences that use conjunction are going to be valid. Let me give you an example. Consider an inference that starts off with two premises. Doesn't matter what the premises are, just any two premises. Call them P and Q, because it doesn't matter what they are. And then the conclusion of the inference is simply going to be the conjunction of those two premises, whatever they were. So the inference can be sketched as follows: P, Q, conclusion, P and Q. Now we can call that a conjunction introduction inference because the conclusion of the inference uses a conjunction. It introduces a conjunction that wasn't present in either of the two premises of the inference. Now, notice, if you look at the first line of the truth table for conjunction, you can see that any conjunction introduction inference is going to have to be valid. Here's how you can see that. If you look at the first line of the truth table for conjunction, that considers the situation in which P is true and Q is true. And in any such situation, according to that truth table, the conjunction P and Q is going to have to be true. Well, now, let's take that point and apply it to the inference from the premise P and the premise Q to the conclusion P and Q. What does that first line of the truth table for conjunction tell you about that inference? Well, it tells you that in any situation in which the premises of that inference, P and Q, are both true, in any situation in which those premises are both true, the conclusion, P and Q, is going to have to be true. But that's just what it is for the inference to be valid. Recall that for an inference to be valid is just for it to be such that there's no possible situation where the premises are true and the conclusion is false. So, from the first line of the truth table for conjunction, you can see that conjunction introduction inferences are all going to be valid. You can also see, by looking at the truth table for conjunction, that another kind of inference is always going to be valid. So consider an inference that starts with only one premise. A premise that conjoins two propositions. Again, never mind what the two propositions are. They could be anything. Call them P and Q, because it doesn't matter what they are. So consider an argument that starts with that one premise, P and Q, and that moves to a conclusion that consists simply of one of those two propositions that is conjoined in the premise. So the conclusion of the argument will be either the proposition P or the proposition Q. Now, an argument like that we can call a conjunction elimination argument because the conclusion of the argument eliminates a conjunction that occurs in the premise of the argument, right? The premise is a conjunction of two propositions, P and Q, and the conclusion is simply one of those two propositions, not conjoined to anything else. So the conclusion is either the proposition P or it's the proposition Q. Now, is that argument going to be valid? Well, if you look at the truth table for conjunction, you'll see that it is going to be valid. In any possible situation in which the premise of that argument, P and Q, is true, both of the two propositions that are conjoined in that premise, both the proposition P and the proposition Q, are also going to be true. So any situation in which the premise of a conjunction elimination argument is true is going to be a situation in which the conclusion of that conjunction elimination argument is true. Therefore, all conjunction elimination arguments are valid, no matter what they're about. And we can see that just by looking at the truth table for conjunction. Now, conjunction introduction and conjunction elimination arguments are not the most interesting kinds of arguments there are, to be sure, but I just wanted to give a simple example for now of how we can use the truth table for a truth functional connective, in this case the truth functional connective conjunction, how we can use the truth table for that connective to discover that certain kinds of arguments are going to be valid. In the next lecture, we'll show how we can use other kinds of truth tables for other connectives, for other truth functional connectives, to show that certain other kinds of arguments are valid. See you next time. In the last lecture, we saw how the word "and" in English can sometimes be used to express the truth functional connective conjunction. And we defined conjunction by means of a truth table for conjunction. Now you'll notice in the last version of the truth table that was presented in the last lecture, the propositions that were conjoined in that truth table were called P and Q. Now you might wonder, what's up with calling propositions P and Q? Why are we using letters to refer to propositions? Is this some kind of strange algebra? Well, today's lecture answers that question. Today's lecture is about variables, like the variables that occur in algebra and similar variables that occur in deductive logic, in the study of the rules for valid argument, which is exactly what Unit 2 is about. So let's begin by talking about rules and why we use variables when we state rules. The first point to make about rules is that rules are general. Rules are designed to apply to many different possible cases. So, for instance, if I say to one of my kids, "Stop hitting your brother right now," well, that's not a rule. That's a command, right? I'm telling one of my kids, "Stop hitting your brother right now." But it's not a rule. It's not general. It doesn't apply to many different possible people. It doesn't apply to many different possible situations. I'm just telling someone what to do, or in this case, what not to do. But if I said, "You should never, under any circumstances, hit another person," well, now that's a rule. It's inherently general. It applies to many different possible situations and many different possible people. So is, "You should never hit your brother." That's also a rule, because again, it applies to many different possible situations. So rules are general, but commands may or may not be general. So how can we express the generality of a rule? Well, notice, if I say something that's not general, if I say to one of my kids, "Stop hitting your brother right now," well, I'm using the expression "right now" to indicate that my order, my command, applies to a particular situation, namely the situation that we're in right now when I issued the order. But if I say, "You should never, under any circumstances, hit another person," I'm using the pronoun "you" and the expression "never under any circumstances" to indicate that the rule that I'm stating applies to a multitude of possible situations. In fact, the pronoun "you," although it's a second-person pronoun, it needn't be understood as referring merely to the person I'm addressing. It could be understood quite generally. Think about the 10 Commandments. "Thou shalt not kill." "Thou" is an archaic form of the second-person singular "you," or in French, "tu." So in those commandments, the second-person pronoun is used not to refer to the specific person, to some specific person addressed by the commandment, but to refer to anyone at all. "You, whoever you are, should not kill." Now notice,
Generality comes in degrees, and rules can be more or less general. So I could say, you should never under any circumstances hit another person. Well, that's a general rule. But I could state a rule that's even more general than that. I could say, you should never under any circumstances do violence to another person. Now that's more general, because I'm not just prohibiting hitting, I'm prohibiting any kind of violence, whether it's hitting, kicking, biting, smacking, slapping. I could make a rule that's even more general than that. I could say you should never under any circumstances do something unkind to another person, whether the unkind thing in question is a form of violence or merely an insulting action, a demeaning action, a condescending action. There are lots of different ways of doing things that are unkind, even if they're not violent. So here we have rules of different levels of generality. If I say, Walter should not force his dog to kill his cat, I'm saying something that has some generality to it. Presumably what I'm saying doesn't simply apply to the present moment, but it applies more generally to a multitude of moments. Not just the present, but maybe the recent past, maybe the near future. But of course I can say something even more general. I could say people should not force creatures to kill innocent creatures. Right? That's more general. I'm not just talking about Walter, I'm talking about people quite generally. I'm not just talking about Walter's dog, but I'm talking about creatures quite generally. And I'm not just talking about Walter's cat, I'm talking about innocent creatures quite generally. And I'm saying that a certain relationship between those three things should not hold. Right? People should not force creatures to kill innocent creatures. But now notice, that last sentence is unclear. In particular, it has two interpretations. There are two ways of understanding that last sentence. Right? We could label them the plural understanding or the distributive understanding. On the plural understanding, what I'm saying is that people should not force a whole bunch of creatures to kill a bunch of innocent creatures. On the distributive interpretation, I'm saying that for any creature that you pick, people should not force that creature to kill an innocent creature. Right? So on the first interpretation of the statement, I'm talking about groups of creatures. And on the second interpretation of the statement, I'm talking about each one of a whole bunch of particular creatures. I'm making a statement about each one of those particular creatures, whereas on the first interpretation, I'm making a statement about the group of creatures. Now, in ordinary language, it's not easy to separate out those two interpretations. You can see just in the last minute how hard I had to work in order to distinguish those two interpretations. But if we use variables, then we can distinguish the two interpretations pretty straightforwardly. We could say, in order to specify the distributive interpretation of that statement, we could say, where X stands for any creature at all, and Y stands for any innocent creature at all, people should not force X to kill Y. So here we're using the variables, X and Y, in order to express the distributive interpretation of people should not force creatures to kill innocent creatures. So variables can be useful to us in clearly expressing certain kinds of distributively interpreted rules. Now, in propositional logic, variables play an equally useful role. So consider an inference that we looked at in the last lecture. From the premise, I'm holding my binoculars and looking through them, it follows that I'm holding my binoculars, right? If it's true that I'm holding my binoculars and looking through them, if that premise is true, then the conclusion, I'm holding my binoculars, must be true. So that right there is a valid deductive argument. There's no possible way for the premise to be true without the conclusion also being true. But notice, in that deductive argument,
There's nothing special about the proposition I'm holding my binoculars or about the proposition I'm looking through my binoculars. In fact, for any argument where the premise is the conjunction of two propositions and the conclusion is one of those two conjoined propositions, that argument is also going to be valid. There's also going to be no possible way for the conjunction of the two propositions, that is the premise of that argument, to be true without the conjoined proposition that is the conclusion of that argument also being true. In other words, there's not going to be any possible way for the premise to be true while the conclusion is false. So any argument of this form right here is going to be valid. Now notice, in the example I just used, as well as in the truth table from last lecture, I was using Roman letters like X or Y or P or Q as variables. But there's nothing sacrosanct about using Roman letters as variables. I could have used anything else, so long as it's easy enough to recognize and easy enough to reproduce. Here are some examples. I could have used a dot or a percentage sign or a plus sign or a happy face or a dollar sign. The problem with all of those is that while they're easy enough to produce, they're not that easy to recognize as variables in propositional logic for the simple reason that they're all used to express other things besides variables in propositional logic. So whereas Roman letters like X, Y, P, Q typically aren't used by themselves to express anything at all other than variables. So we can use them safely as variables in propositional logic without running the risk that people won't recognize them for what they are, that people will think that they're expressing something else. Notice, just as we have notation, Roman letters serving as notation for variables, we also have notation to express truth functions. For instance, in the last lecture I introduced the truth functional connective conjunction, and normally we express conjunction using this ampersand right here. And there are other truth functions as well that we're going to learn about in upcoming lectures. One is disjunction, which we normally express using an uppercase V, and another one is negation, which we can express using either one of these two signs that looks a little bit like a minus sign from arithmetic, but not exactly the same. These are two different ways of expressing negation. Now, again, there's nothing sacrosanct about this notation. There have been different notational systems that people have used. There's nothing better about this notational system. We just have to pick one and stick to it for the sake of consistency. So this is the one that we're picking, not for any good reason, just because we have to pick one. So in upcoming lectures, you're going to learn about disjunction and about negation, and when we talk about those truth functions, we're going to use the notation that you see here. Okay, see you next time.
Today, we're going to talk about the truth functional connective that we'll call disjunction. Now, disjunction is a truth functional connective that in English is usually expressed by means of the word or, O-R. But there are a couple different ways of using that word or. Let me give you some examples. Suppose you ask me, who won the game last night? And I say, well, either Manchester won it or Barcelona won it. But there, I'm clearly trying to indicate that while Manchester may have won it and Barcelona may have won it, they didn't both win the game. If Manchester was playing Barcelona last night, then they couldn't both have won. Right? Soccer doesn't work like that. Either one team wins or the other team wins, but they can't both win. So if I say either Manchester won it or Barcelona won it, what I mean is that either one of two possibilities occurred. Either Manchester won it or Barcelona won it, but they couldn't both have occurred. But sometimes when I use the word or, I don't mean to convey anything like that. For instance, suppose I say to you, this is breakfast or lunch. Now, I'm not suggesting, when I say this is breakfast or lunch, I'm not suggesting that it can't be both. It could be breakfast, it could be lunch, or it could be both. And when I say this is breakfast or lunch, I mean it could be one, it could be the other, it could be both. So there, in that second usage, I'll say or is inclusive. It includes both of the options and the possibility of their both being true. In the first usage, where I said either Manchester won or Barcelona won, I'll say or is exclusive. In other words, either one is true or the other is true, but they can't both be true. So or can be used exclusively to mean that either one of two options is true, but they can't both be true, or could be used inclusively to mean one of two options could be true, or they could both be true. Now, the truth functional connective disjunction is expressed in English by the use of the inclusive or, the or that leaves open the possibility that both of the two options could be true. So, what's the truth table for the truth functional connective disjunction going to look like? Well, you're going to start with two possibilities, two propositions that are connected by the truth functional connective disjunction. Doesn't matter what the propositions are, just call them P and Q because it doesn't matter what they are. So there's P, there's Q, and then there's the disjunction of P and Q, which will symbolize as follows: P disjunction, which looks like a V, Q. Now, when is P disjunction Q going to be true? Remember, disjunction is expressed by the inclusive or, so it's going to be true whenever P is true. And it's also going to be true whenever Q is true. And, of course, since it's expressed by the inclusive or, it's going to be true whenever P and Q are both true. So, the truth table for disjunction is going to look like this. Right? The first three lines, the lines that consider the possibility of P and Q's both being true, or P's being true and Q's being false, or P's being false and Q's being true, and all three of those lines, the disjunction P or Q will be true. The only scenario in which P or Q is false is the scenario in which P and Q are both false, in which neither P nor Q is true. Now that we've learned the truth table for the truth functional connective disjunction, we can use that truth table to figure out when certain arguments that use disjunction are going to be valid. For example, consider this simple argument. Premise 1, I'm going to tickle you with my right hand. Premise 2, I'm going to tickle you with my left hand. Conclusion, I'm going to tickle you with either my right or my left hand. Is that argument valid? Well, it obviously is valid, but you can use the truth table for disjunction to explain why it's valid. Look at the truth table for disjunction again. In this argument, we have premise 1 being the proposition, I'm going to tickle you with my right hand, premise 2 being the proposition, I'm going to tickle you with my left hand, and a conclusion that's the disjunction of those two propositions. Well, what can you tell from the truth table for disjunction? What you can tell is that in a situation in which P is true and Q is true, in which both of two propositions are going to be true, the disjunction of those two propositions is also going to be true. You see, that's what you can read off from the first line of the truth table. In a situation in which each of two propositions is true, their disjunction has to be true. So, in the argument that I just gave you, which has as premise 1, I'm going to tickle you with my right hand, and as premise 2, I'm going to tickle you with my left hand, that argument has to be valid because the conclusion of that argument is simply the disjunction of the two premises. So there's no possible way for the premises of that argument to be true while the conclusion is false. If the premises of that argument are true, the conclusion has to be true. We could think of that argument as a kind of disjunction introduction argument because Just as in the case of a conjunction introduction argument, where the conclusion introduces a conjunction that wasn't there in the premises, in this argument, the conclusion introduces a disjunction that wasn't there in the premises. Right? There were two premises. I'm going to tickle you with my right hand, and I'm going to tickle you with my left hand. The conclusion introduces the disjunction of those two premises. The conclusion just is the disjunction of those two premises. But notice, even though that disjunction introduction argument is valid, there are even simpler disjunction introduction arguments that are valid. Consider, for instance, the argument that starts with just one premise. Could be anything, call it P. And that draws as a conclusion the disjunction of P with anything else. So let's say P is the premise, I'm going to tickle you with my right hand. And then the conclusion is that it's just the disjunction of that premise, I'm going to tickle you with my right hand, with any other proposition, like, say, I'm going to tickle you with my left hand. That argument is going to have to be valid. And you can read that off the truth table for disjunction. Because you can see that in any situation in which one of the disjuncts of a disjunction is true, the disjunction is going to have to be true. So any disjunction introduction argument that starts with just one premise and that concludes the disjunction of that premise with anything else, any such argument is going to have to be valid. There's no possible way for the premise of that argument to be true while the conclusion is false. So all disjunction introduction arguments are valid. But what about disjunction elimination arguments? Well, remember, conjunction elimination arguments are valid because if you start off with a premise that states the conjunction of two propositions, then the conclusion that is either one of those two conjoined propositions, either one of those propositions, the conclusion is going to have to be true whenever that conjunction is true. You saw that from the truth table for conjunction. But what about with disjunction? Does it work that way with disjunction? Well, consider an argument that starts from the premise, I'm going to tickle you with either my right or my left hand. And then it draws the conclusion that is simply one of those two disjoint propositions. Let's say it draws the conclusion, I'm going to tickle you with my right hand. Is that argument valid? No, it's not. Because there's a possible situation in which the premise, I'm going to tickle you with either my right hand or my left hand, is true, while the conclusion, I'm going to tickle you with my right hand, is false. Namely, the situation in which I'm going to tickle you with my left hand. In that situation, the premise would be true, but the conclusion would be false. So that disjunction elimination argument is not valid. And you can also see that by looking at the truth table for disjunction. If you look at the truth table for disjunction, you'll see that there are three possible scenarios in which the premise, I'm going to tickle you with either my right hand or my left hand, is true. The three possible scenarios are the three scenarios in which both of the disjuncts are true, the first disjunct is true and the second one false, or the first disjunct is false and the second one is true. Well, there are three possible scenarios in which that disjunction is true. When I say I'm not going to tickle you with my right hand, I'm ruling out two of those scenarios, namely the two scenarios in which it's true that I tickle you with my right hand. But that still leaves open a scenario in which it's true that I'm going to tickle you with either my right hand or my left hand. But for the disjunction elimination argument to be valid, it would have to be the case that in every scenario in which the disjunction, I'm going to tickle you with either my right or my left hand, is true, each of those disjuncts is true. But that's not the case, and you can see that just by looking at the truth table for disjunction. So the truth table for disjunction shows you why it is that disjunction introduction arguments are all valid, but simple disjunction elimination arguments that start with a premise that's just the disjunction of two propositions and end with a conclusion that is simply one of those disjoint propositions by itself, those arguments are not valid. You can see that by the truth table from disjunction. In the last couple of lectures, we've learned about the truth functional connective conjunction, and we've learned about the truth functional connective disjunction. Now, both of these connectives can be used to take propositions and put them together to create new propositions whose truth depends solely on the truth of the propositions that you used as their ingredients. Now, in today's short lecture, I just want to make the point that just as you can combine propositions using conjunction and you can combine propositions using disjunction, you can also use conjunction and disjunction together to string together a bunch of propositions into a larger proposition. Let me give you an example to illustrate this point. Suppose I say, I'm going to tickle you with this hand. And then I say, and I'm either going to tickle you with this hand or with this hand. Okay? Now here, what I've done is string together three propositions. The proposition, I'm going to tickle you with this hand, and the proposition, and I'm either going to tickle you with this hand or with this hand. So there, we've created a new proposition by stringing together three other propositions using conjunction and disjunction. Now notice we can construct a truth table to show how the truth of the larger proposition, I'm going to tickle you with this hand and with either this hand or this hand, how the truth of that larger proposition depends on the truth of the propositions that go into creating it. Okay, so there are three propositions that go into creating it, and they're connected in different ways. So one of the propositions was, I'm going to tickle you with this hand. Let's find terms to distinguish the hands so I don't have to keep waving around all my hands. Let's call this hand number 1. And now the proposition we can say is, I'm going to tickle you with hand number 1 and with either hand number 2 or hand number 3. Okay, so there are three propositions that go into creating that larger proposition. So the three propositions are these. First, I'm going to tickle you with hand number 1. Second, I'm going to tickle you with hand number 2. And third, I'm going to tickle you with hand number 3. Now, we can use the truth table to show when precisely it would be true that I'm going to tickle you with hand number 1 and with either hand number 2 or hand number 3. Right? How does the truth of that whole statement depend on the truth of the three propositions that go into creating it? Well, that whole statement, I'm going to tickle you with hand number 1 and with either hand number 2 or hand number 3, is a conjunction. It's a conjunction with two conjuncts. The first conjunct is, I'm going to tickle you with hand number 1. And the second conjunct is, I'm going to tickle you with either hand number 2 or hand number 3. So since it's a conjunction, we know that for it to be true, both of its conjuncts have to be true. So it has to be true that I'm going to tickle you with hand number 1. So that proposition, I'm going to tickle you with hand number 1, that proposition has to be true. Does it have to be true that I'm going to tickle you with hand number 2? No. All that has to be true is that I'm either going to tickle you with hand number 2 or with hand number 3. So that disjunction, I'm going to tickle you with hand number 2 or with hand number 3, has to be true. But for the disjunction to be true, it doesn't have to be true that I'm going to tickle you with hand number 2. After all, there's a scenario where I'm not going to tickle you with hand number 2, and yet it's still true that I'm going to tickle you with either hand number 2 or hand number 3. And for the disjunction, I'm going to tickle you with hand number 2 or hand number 3 to be true, it doesn't have to be true that I'm going to tickle you with hand number 3. Again, remember, there's a scenario where I'm not going to tickle you with hand number 3, but it's still going to be the case that I'm going to tickle you with either hand number 2 or hand number 3. But what does have to be true for the disjunction to be true is that at least one of those other two propositions are true. It's at least true that either I'm going to tickle you with hand number 2, or I'm going to tickle you with hand number 3, or both. But at least one of those has to be true. So, for the whole proposition, I'm going to tickle you with hand number 1 and with hand number 2 or hand number 3. For that whole proposition to be true, it's got to be true that I'm going to tickle you with hand number 1, and it's either got to be true that I'm going to tickle you with hand number 2, or it's got to be true that I'm going to tickle you with hand number 3. So if we look at the truth table, we can see precisely which lines are going to make the whole proposition true. So here's how we can construct a truth table for a complex proposition that combines conjunction and disjunction. And notice, by the way, when we're combining conjunction and disjunction, the order in which we combine them matters. We can say that conjunction and disjunction are not associative. What matters to determining the truth table of the proposition that they're used to create is not just the occurrence of conjunction and disjunction, but what order they're taken in. In the proposition that I considered just a moment ago, I'm going to tickle you with hand number 1 and with either hand number 2 or hand number 3, that proposition has a different truth table than the proposition, I'm going to tickle you with hand number 1 and hand number 2, or I'm going to tickle you with hand number 3. That second proposition has a very different truth table from the first, as we can see if we construct the two truth tables and compare them. So, conjunction and disjunction are not associative. The truth table for the proposition that they create depends on the order in which we apply conjunction and disjunction. In the last few lectures, we've talked about the truth-functional connectives, conjunction and disjunction. We've gone over the truth tables for those connectives and shown how we can use the truth tables to figure out when arguments that use conjunction or disjunction are valid. Now today, what I want to do is talk about a propositional device that's not a connective, but that's what I'll call an operator. It doesn't connect two propositions to make a larger proposition. Rather, what it does is it just operates on a single proposition to make another proposition. You can think of it as converting one proposition to another proposition. Now, there are lots of propositional operators. For instance, consider the phrase, I believe that. Right, that's a propositional operator. You take any proposition, let's say the proposition, it's raining today. And now you put I believe that in front of it, and you get a new proposition. I believe that it's raining. So I believe that is an example of a propositional operator. But I want to talk about a kind of propositional operator that is a truth-functional operator. That's to say, the truth or falsity of the proposition that results from applying that operator depends solely upon the truth or falsity of the proposition to which the operator is applied. Now, the propositional operator, I believe that, is clearly not truth-functional. For instance, suppose it is raining today. Suppose it's true that it's raining today. What does that tell you about whether or not I believe that it's raining today? Well, nothing. It could be raining today even though I don't believe that it's raining today. It could be raining today even though I do believe that it's raining today. The truth or falsity of the proposition, I believe that it's raining today, doesn't depend solely upon the truth or falsity of the proposition, it is raining today. It depends on other things as well. It depends in particular on my psychology. So the propositional operator, I believe that, is not a truth-functional operator. But there is a propositional operator that's truth-functional. In English, the propositional operator that's truth-functional is expressed by the phrase, it is not the case that, or sometimes simply by the use of the phrase not. The propositional operator that I have in mind is called negation. Negation is a truth-functional operator that takes any proposition and creates a new proposition whose truth value is the opposite of the truth value of the original proposition. So you take any proposition, if it's true, then the negation of that proposition is false. Take any proposition. If it's false, then the negation of that proposition is true. So negation is a propositional operator that's an example of a truth-functional operator. The truth of the proposition that results from applying negation depends solely on the truth of the proposition to which negation is applied. In that respect, negation is very different from the propositional operator, I believe that. Now, I said just a moment ago that sometimes the English word not is used to express the truth-functional operator negation. But it's not always used to do that. Let me give you an example. Consider the proposition, Walter has stopped beating his dogs. Okay, now that's a proposition. It's something that could be true or false, and it's something that could be the premise or the conclusion of an argument. But suppose we put the word not into that proposition. I say, Walter has not stopped beating his dogs. Is that the negation of Walter has stopped beating his dogs? Well, Let's think about that for a moment. Suppose it's true that Walter has stopped beating his dogs. Well, then pretty clearly it seems like it's false that Walter has not stopped beating his dogs. If he has stopped beating his dogs, then anyone who says that he's not stopped beating his dogs is saying something false. But now suppose it's false that Walter has stopped beating his dogs. Does that mean it's true that Walter has not stopped beating his dogs? Well, not necessarily. Think about the different reasons why it could be false that Walter has stopped beating his dogs. It could be false that Walter has stopped beating his dogs because he's still beating his dogs. Or it could be false that Walter has stopped beating his dogs because, in fact, he never did beat his dogs. Or it could be false that Walter has stopped beating his dogs because Walter doesn't have any dogs. For that matter, it could be false that Walter has stopped beating his dogs because there is no such person as Walter. Walter doesn't exist. Walter is a mere figment of your imagination. So there are all sorts of reasons why it could be false that Walter has stopped beating his dogs. And in some of those situations, it would not be true that Walter has not stopped beating his dogs. For instance, if Walter doesn't have any dogs, then, even though it's false that Walter has stopped beating his dogs, it's also false that Walter has not stopped beating his dogs. So, in that example, the word not is not being used as negation. So suppose I say, Walter has stopped beating his dogs. Not. Okay, now there, where I say not, all I'm doing is operating on the original proposition, Walter has stopped beating his dogs, and creating a new proposition whose truth value is the opposite of that original proposition. So if I say Walter has stopped beating his dogs, but Walter doesn't exist, or Walter never had any dogs, or Walter never did beat his dogs, in any of those situations, if I say Walter has stopped beating his dogs, not, what I just said is true. So sometimes the word not is used to express the truth functional operator negation. But often it's not used that way. Often, when we want to express the truth functional operator negation, we have to use the more cumbersome English phrase, it is not the case that. Now, I've told you how negation works. It operates on a particular proposition to create a new proposition whose truth value is the opposite of the truth value of the original proposition. But because negation works in such a simple way, its truth table is going to be very simple. Right? So consider any proposition, no matter what. Any proposition, call it P. When P is true, the negation of P is going to be false. And when P is false, the negation of P is going to be true. That's how negation works. In the last several lectures, we learned about the truth functional connectives, conjunction and disjunction, and we learned about the truth functional operator negation. Now today I'd like to make a point about how these truth functional devices, these connectives and operators, can be combined so as to create larger propositions out of smaller propositions. So consider this conjunction. For lunch, I'm going to eat this and this. That's a conjunction. It's the conjunction of the proposition that for lunch I'm going to eat this, and the proposition that for lunch I'm going to eat this. Now, if we apply negation to that conjunction, what are we saying? We're saying it's not the case that for lunch I'm going to eat this and this. Now that leaves it open that maybe for lunch I'm just going to have one of these two things. Maybe just this thing, whatever that is. So if I negate a conjunction, all I'm doing is saying it's not the case that both of the two conjuncts are true. But suppose I create a disjunction out of the two propositions, that for lunch I'm going to eat this, and for lunch I'm going to eat this, right? I create a disjunction as follows. I say, for lunch I'm either going to eat this or this. Now if I negate that, if I say it's not the case that for lunch I'm either going to eat this or this, then I'm saying something that rules out that I'm going to eat either of them for lunch. It's not just that I'm not going to eat both of them. I'm not going to eat either of them, right? My lunch is not going to involve this, and it's also not going to involve this. So, negating a conjunction gives us a different result than negating a disjunction. And that's exactly what we should expect if we look at the truth table that results from applying negation to a conjunction and applying negation to a disjunction. Remember, when we apply negation to a conjunction, we're applying negation to a proposition that's true only when both of its two conjuncts are true. In every other scenario, it's false. So, if we apply negation to that proposition, what do we get? We get a proposition that's going to be true in 3 out of 4 possible scenarios. It's going to be true whenever both of the conjuncts are false, and it's going to be true whenever either one of the conjuncts is false. The only situation in which that proposition is going to be false is when both of the conjuncts are true. But now, contrast that with applying negation to a disjunction. When we apply negation to a disjunction, we're applying negation to a proposition that's true whenever either one of its disjuncts is true. So we end up getting a proposition that's false in 3 out of 4 possible scenarios. It's false so long as either one of the disjuncts is true. So applying negation to a disjunction is going to give us a different result than applying negation to a conjunction, and we can see that by looking at the truth tables for negation, disjunction, and conjunction.
In the last lecture, we saw how you can combine conjunction and disjunction to build up even larger propositions from propositional units. In this lecture, we're going to talk about 2 properties, commutativity and associativity, properties that we find in conjunction and in disjunction, but that we don't find in other truth functions, like the conditional, which we'll study later this week. Okay, so what are commutativity and associativity? Well, let me start by giving a definition of commutativity. A function of 2 things is commutative, it has commutativity, when it delivers the same result no matter what order it operates on those things. Okay, now that's a very abstract characterization, and that's a characterization that can apply to functions in all different domains. For instance, in arithmetic, there are functions like addition, and addition is an example of a commutative function, right? Addition is a function that can operate on 2 inputs. You can add 2 numbers together, and the result that you get when you add 2 numbers together doesn't depend on the order in which you add the numbers. For example, 2 plus 3 is the same as 3 plus 2. And in general, for any 2 numbers, x and y, x plus y is the same as y plus x. So addition is commutative. Addition is an example of a function that has commutativity. Another example of an arithmetical function that's commutative is multiplication. For example, 4 multiplied by 8 is the same as 8 multiplied by 4. More generally, for any 2 numbers, x and y, x multiplied by y is the same as y multiplied by x. So multiplication is a commutative function. It's a function that has commutativity. But notice, not all arithmetical functions are commutative. For instance, subtraction is not commutative, right? 7 minus 3 is not the same as 3 minus 7. And more generally, for most numbers x and y, x minus y is not the same as y minus x. That's not true for every assignment of numbers to x and y, but it's true for most. Generally, we can't expect x minus y to be equal to y minus x. So subtraction is not a commutative function. Neither is division. So addition and multiplication are commutative, but subtraction and division are not commutative. Now, the same points can be made about truth functional connectives in propositional logic. For instance, the truth functional connective conjunction is commutative. Right? Consider the proposition, I'm standing and waving. That's the conjunction of two propositions, I'm standing and I'm waving. Right? I'm standing and waving is the conjunction of those two propositions. Well, that's the same proposition as I'm waving and standing. Right? They're just two different ways of saying the same thing. Maybe one is a more elegant way of saying it than the other, but they're saying the same thing. What they're saying is the same. In general, the conjunction of any two propositions, P and Q, is exactly the same as the conjunction of the propositions Q and P. Conjunction operates on two propositions, and it doesn't matter what order you put the propositions in. P conjunction Q is the same proposition as Q conjunction P. So conjunction is a commutative function, a commutative truth function. The same is true of disjunction. Disjunction is also a commutative truth function. So consider the proposition, I'm standing or waving. That's a disjunction. But it's the same proposition as I'm waving or standing. In general, for any two propositions P and Q, the disjunction P or Q is the same proposition as the disjunction Q or P. So disjunction is a commutative truth function, like conjunction. But later on this week, we'll learn about another truth function that we'll call the conditional. Sometimes it's called the material conditional. But the conditional is not a commutative truth function. With the conditional, the order in which it operates on propositions determines the result that you get. We'll see that later this week when we study the conditional. Okay, so that's commutativity. Now what about associativity? Well, what's associativity? Here's a definition. A function of three or more things is associative when it delivers the same result no matter what order it operates on those things. Okay, so let's look at some examples of associative functions and of functions that are not associative. First, we'll begin with arithmetic. So just as addition is a commutative function, it's also an associative function. To illustrate, consider a case where addition applies to three things instead of just two. So consider adding 2 to 3 plus 6. Well, the sum of 2 and 3 plus 6, notice that's going to be the same as the sum of 2 plus 3 and 6. Right, both of them are going to add up to 11. And more generally, for any three numbers x, y, and z, the sum of x and y plus z is going to be equal to the sum of x plus y and z. It doesn't matter whether we group the y and z together and then add that to the x, or whether we group the x and y together and add that to the z. Either way, we get the same result. So addition is an associative function. It's an example of an arithmetical function that has associativity. The same is true for multiplication. Notice if we multiply 2 by the product of 3 and 6, we get the same number as we get if we multiply the product of 2 and 3 by 6. Either way, we get 36. So, in general, for any three numbers, x, y, and z, the product of x and y times z is the same as the product of x times y and z. So that explains why multiplication is associative. It's an example of an arithmetical function that has associativity. But not all arithmetical functions are associative. In particular, subtraction is not associative. Take any three numbers, x, y, and z. Now, start by subtracting z from y, and then subtract the result of that from x. You're going to get a different number in general than if you start by subtracting y from x and then subtract z from that number. Right? So x minus parentheses y minus z is in general not the same as x minus y minus z. So subtraction is not associative, and neither, for that matter, is division. So addition and multiplication are associative, just as they're commutative. Subtraction and division are not associative, just as they're not commutative. Analogously, with truth functions, we can see that conjunction is associative. For example, consider the proposition, I'm standing and he's sitting and waving. Well, that's the same as the proposition, I'm standing and he's sitting and he's also waving. In general, for any three propositions, P, Q, and R, the conjunction of P with Q and R is going to be the same proposition as the conjunction P and Q with R. Now, just as conjunction is associative, so too is disjunction. We can see an example. For instance, if I say, I'm standing or he's sitting or waving, well, that's the same proposition as I'm standing or he's sitting or he's waving. In general, for any three propositions, P, Q, and R, the disjunction of P with Q or R is going to be the same proposition as the disjunction of P or Q with R. So disjunction, like conjunction, is associative. But again, not all truth functions are associative. Later this week, we're going to learn about a truth function called the conditional that is not associative. When the conditional operates on three or more inputs, it matters very much the order in which it operates on those inputs, because depending on the order, you end up with a different propositional result. Okay, so that's enough about commutativity and associativity. See you next time.
Today's lecture is about conditionals. Conditionals are a kind of truth-functional connective that we haven't discussed yet. But today we're going to introduce this new kind of truth-functional connective, discuss the truth table for it, and say why it's important. It's especially important in understanding the rules by which to assess the validity of deductive arguments. Now, in order to introduce this new truth-functional connective, the conditional, I want to start by telling you a story. Imagine that Walter's been breaking into my office and stealing my stuff. So each day I come into my office and I find that more and more of my stuff is gone. One day he steals my electronics, and another day he steals my coffee cup, and then another day he steals my clothing, and then yet another day he steals my glasses, and before long there's very little stuff in my office. Now, as this happens, I start to get suspicious, and I decide to have Walter followed by a private investigator, just to figure out exactly whether or not Walter is stealing my stuff. So I have the private investigator follow Walter everywhere he goes, right? He follows him to his house at night, then he follows him to the bar early in the morning, he follows him to the golf course later in the morning, then he follows him to the water polo tournament in the afternoon, follows him everywhere he goes. Now, suppose you ask me, is the private investigator having lunch at that Cuban restaurant, New Havana? Now, I might say to you, well, if Walter is having lunch there, then the private investigator is having lunch there. Okay, now notice what I just said. I said, if Walter is having lunch there, then the private investigator is having lunch there. That phrase, if, then, can be used to connect two propositions. The proposition, Walter is having lunch at New Havana, with the proposition, the private investigator is having lunch in New Havana. So that phrase, if, then, works as a propositional connective. It connects two propositions to make a larger proposition. But does it work as a truth-functional connective? Now, I'd like to argue that it does. Okay, so how are we going to argue that if, then is not just a propositional connective, but is also a truth functional connective? Well, I'd like to begin by considering the following truth functional construction. Consider the negation of the conjunction of P and the negation of Q. Right? I've written that out here. The negation of the conjunction of P and the negation of Q. Now suppose I say that whole proposition is true. Well, if I say that whole proposition is true, then what I'm saying is just that the negation of that proposition, in other words, just the conjunction of P and the negation of Q, that proposition is false. But what does it mean when I say that the conjunction of P and the negation of Q is false? Well, what I'm saying there is that if P is true, then the negation of Q has to be false. Right? Because if the conjunction of P and the negation of Q is false, then you can't have both of those conjuncts being true. At least one of them has to be false. So if P is true, then the other conjunct, the negation of Q, has to be false. So you're saying there that if P is true, then the negation of Q is false. But remember, for the negation of Q to be false is just the same thing as for Q to be true, because the negation of Q has just the opposite truth value of whatever Q has. So to say if P is true, then the negation of Q is false is just the same as to say if P is true, then Q is true. But that's exactly what you're doing whenever you use if-then as a propositional connective. You're saying if one proposition is true, like let's say Walter is eating lunch at New Havana, then another proposition is true, like let's say the private investigator is eating lunch at New Havana. If P, then Q, that proposition follows from the negation of the conjunction P and the negation of Q. But while if P then Q follows from the negation of that conjunction, is it equivalent to it? Now I just argued that if P then Q follows from the negation of the conjunction P and the negation of Q. But now what I'd like to do is argue that latter proposition, the negation of the conjunction of P and the negation of Q, that proposition follows from if P then Q. Consider for a moment what you're saying when you say if P then Q. You're saying if P is true, then Q has got to be true. So you're ruling out a certain option. You're ruling out the possibility that P is true while Q is false. When you say if P then Q, you're ruling out the possibility that P is true and Q is false. In other words, you're ruling out the possibility that P is true and the negation of Q is true. In other words, you're saying P and the negation of Q, that conjunction right there, has got to be false. In other words, you're saying that the negation of the conjunction P and the negation of Q is true. So you see, the negation of the conjunction P and the negation of Q follows from if P then Q. And if P then Q follows from the negation of the conjunction of P and the negation of Q. So what that tells us is that the proposition if P then Q is going to be true in precisely the same situations as the proposition which is the negation of the conjunction P and the negation of Q. So if they're true in all the same situations, that just means that they're going to have the same truth table. In other words, if P then Q is going to have a truth table, and it's going to have precisely the same truth table as the negation of the conjunction of P and the negation of Q. That's what we learn by noticing that if P then Q follows from the negation of the conjunction of P and the negation of Q, and that the negation of the conjunction of P and the negation of Q follows from if P then Q, is that they have the same truth table. And since if P then Q has a truth table, that proves that it's a truth functional connective. It's a propositional connective that creates propositions whose truth value depends solely on the truth values of the propositions that go into it. So it's a truth functional connective. Now that we've talked about the conditional and we've explained how the truth table for the conditional works, let's talk about some rules governing our use of the conditional, and then let me say something about why the conditional is an especially important truth functional connective. So first I want to talk about a rule called modus ponens. Modus ponens says, from the premises P, whatever P is, and if P then Q, whatever exactly P and Q are, infer the conclusion Q. That's what modus ponens says. Now notice, we can use the truth table for the conditional to show that modus ponens is a good rule of inference. Look here. So suppose you know that P is true and if P then Q is true. So what does that tell you? Well, since P is true, we've got to be in one of these first two scenarios, one of the two top rows of the truth table. And since the conditional if P then Q is true, we've got to be in either the first, third, or fourth row of that truth table. But then, what does that tell us? Well, if we've got to be in one of the two top rows, and we've got to be in either the first, third, or fourth row, then the only possible choice is that we've got to be in the top row. In other words, we've got to be in a situation in which P is true, if P then Q is true, and Q is true. Another way of putting that is, in any situation in which P is true, and if P then Q is true, Q has got to be true. And so modus ponens is a good rule of inference. If we follow modus ponens, we'll never give an invalid argument. Right? No modus ponens argument can be invalid, because whenever P is true and if P then Q is true, Q has got to be true. Okay, so modus ponens is a good rule of inference. There's another rule called modus tollens, which says the following. From the premises not Q, the negation of Q, and the premise if P then Q, infer the conclusion not P, or the negation of P. Now, is that a good rule? Well, once again, we can use the truth table to see that it is. So here's what the two premises tell us. They tell us if P then Q is true, so we've got to be in the first, third, or fourth rows of that truth table. And they also tell us that the negation of Q is true. In other words, that Q itself is false, right? Because when the negation of Q is true, then Q is false. So that tells us we've got to be in either the second or the fourth row of that truth table. Okay, so here's what the premises tell us. We're either in the second or fourth row of the truth table, and we're in either the first, third, or fourth row of the truth table. Well, the only option left is that we're in the fourth row of the truth table. In other words, if we're in a situation in which if P then Q is true, and not Q is true, in other words, Q is false, then the only possible situation we could be in is a situation in which P is false. But of course, that's a situation in which not Q is true. So if we follow modus tollens and make arguments that follow that rule, all of our arguments will be valid. Any argument that has as its premises, two premises of the form if P then Q and the negation of Q, and has as its conclusion the negation of P, any argument of that form will have to be valid. And that's what we can see using the truth table for the conditional. So modus ponens and modus tollens are two rules governing our use of the conditional, and we can see using the truth table that they're both valid rules of argument, just like conjunction elimination or disjunction introduction. Okay, Now I've said something about what the conditional means, what its truth table is, and what some good rules for its usage are. Why is the conditional an important truth functional connective? It's pretty clear why disjunction and conjunction are important truth functional connectives. They're very intuitive. They seem to correspond to notions that we operate with in everyday life. But what about the conditional? Here's what makes the conditional especially important for propositional logic. Consider any argument whatsoever that has some premises and a conclusion. Let's call the premises of that argument P and the conclusion C. Now, whatever that argument is, if that argument from premises P to conclusion C is valid, then the conditional, if P then C, has got to be true. And here's why. If the argument from P to C is valid, what that tells us is that there's no possible way for P to be true while C is false. But what does it mean for the conditional if P then C to be true? All it means is that if P is true, then C has got to be true. It's not the case that P is true and C is false. So, whenever the argument from P to C is valid, the conditional if P then C is going to be true, and so we can use the conditional to express in the form of a single proposition the validity of an argument from premises P to conclusion C, whatever that argument is about. The conditional can be used to express the validity of that argument, and that's what makes the conditional especially useful in propositional logic. We've been talking about the truth functional connective that I've called the conditional. And I said that in English, the conditional is normally expressed by using the phrase if, then. But that statement needs some qualification. First of all, there are some occasions on which we use the phrase if, then, but we're not expressing the truth functional connective, which is the conditional. In fact, we're not expressing any truth functional connective at all. For instance, if we use if, then around phrases that are in the subjunctive mood, then often what we end up with is not a truth functional connective. If I say, if I had been 4 feet tall, then I would have been in the Guinness Book of World Records, I'm not saying something, the truth or falsity of which is a product of the truth or falsity of the ingredient propositions. Right? The truth or falsity of, if I had been 4 feet tall, then I would be in the Guinness Book of World Records, or I would have been in the Guinness Book of World Records, depends on things other than just the truth or falsity of my being 4 feet tall and my being in the Guinness Book of World Records. It depends on all sorts of other things as well. So that's a situation where the phrase if, then isn't being used as a truth functional connective. It's being used as a propositional connective. It builds a larger proposition out of 2 ingredient propositions, but there the propositional connective is not truth functional. In order for the propositional connective expressed by if and then to be truth functional, the propositions inside if and then can't be in the subjunctive mood. I should also mention that there are sometimes other phrases in English that are used to express the truth functional conditional. For instance, we sometimes just use the word if. So for instance, I might say to you, the private investigator is eating lunch at New Havana if Walter is eating lunch there. There. I just connected 2 propositions using the word if, but what I'm expressing is a truth functional conditional. It's the same thing as I would have been expressing if I had said, if Walter is eating lunch at New Havana, then the private investigator is eating lunch at New Havana. Right? Those are just 2 different ways of saying the same thing. But in one case, I use the words if and then, and in the other case, I just use the word if. So sometimes we express the truth functional conditional just by use of the word if. We could also use the phrase only if, and that could also express the truth functional conditional. For instance, I might say, Walter is eating lunch at New Havana only if the private investigator is eating lunch at New Havana. And that expresses just the same thing as saying, if the private investigator is eating lunch at New Havana, then Walter is too. Right? They express just the same thing. They're true or false in just the same circumstances. It's just a different phrasing. Different phrasing, same meaning. So, the truth functional conditional, while it's often expressed in English using the words if and then, is sometimes expressed using other words, and it's not always expressed by means of if then. Sometimes if then expresses propositional connectives that are not truth functional. In the next lecture, we're going to talk about biconditionals. Today we're going to talk about a new propositional connective, a truth functional connective that I'll call the biconditional. Now, what's a biconditional? In order to explain what a biconditional, let me start off by telling you the following story. And this is a true story, I should add. When I was in 8th grade, I remember my first class in the morning was a math class, and there was a boy who sat next to me in math class. The teacher called him Bob. My third class, later in the morning, was a science class, and there was a boy who sat next to me in the science class, and the teacher called him George. And I was struck by the fact that Bob and George, who sat next to me in math and science class respectively, had the same last name, and they also bore an uncanny resemblance to each other. Well, one day, I asked Bob if he had a brother named George, and it turned out that he didn't have a brother named George. In fact, Bob was George. It was one and the same boy, and they just went by two different names to the two different teachers. But suppose that all you knew from my description of the situation was that there was a boy who sat next to me in math class named Bob and a boy who sat next to me in science class named George, and you asked me one day, was Bob born in the United States? Now, I might say to you, well, Bob was born in the United States if and only if George was. Now, there I'm using the phrase if and only if. Now, remember how the phrase if works. If I say if to connect two propositions, P if Q, that's equivalent to saying if Q then P. But now remember how only if works. If I say P only if Q, that's equivalent to saying if P then Q. So when I use the phrase if and only if, I'm conjoining the conditional if P then Q and the conditional if Q then P. And so I get what I'll call a biconditional. A biconditional is a propositional connective that connects two propositions into a larger proposition, and the larger proposition is true just in case the two propositions that are part of it have the same truth value. In other words, the larger proposition P if and only if Q is going to be true just in case P and Q are both true, or P and Q are both false. So, I could say George was born in the United States if and only if Bob was. Under what circumstances is that proposition going to be true? Well, it'll be true if George and Bob were both born in the United States, or, well, I guess it's misleading to say both, because really there's only one boy that we're talking about. If George was born in the United States and Bob was born in the United States, it'll be true when both of those propositions are true. But it'll also be true when George was not born in the United States and Bob was not born in the United States. In other words, it'll be true when both of those two propositions are false. What makes true the proposition George was born in the United States if and only if Bob was, is simply that the two propositions that are part of it, George was born in the United States and Bob was born in the United States, have the same truth value, whatever that truth value is, whether it's the truth value true or the truth value false. As long as those two propositions have the same truth value, it's going to be true that George was born in the United States if and only if Bob was, and so the biconditional connecting those two propositions, George was born in the U.S. and Bob was born in the U.S., that biconditional is going to be true. So we can state the truth table for the truth functional connective, which is the biconditional, as follows. biconditional connects any two propositions. Let's call them P and Q, doesn't matter what they are. When P is true and Q is true, then the biconditional P, if and only if Q, is going to be true. When P is true and Q is false, then the biconditional P, if and only if Q, is going to be false. When P is false and Q is true, then the biconditional P, if and only if Q, is going to be false. And finally, if P is false and Q is false, then the biconditional P, if and only if Q, is going to be true. So that's the truth table for the biconditional. Now, in the last couple of lectures, I described both the conditional and the biconditional as truth functional connectives, and I've given some reason to think that they are truth functional connectives. But you might worry that there are some examples that suggest that both the conditional and the biconditional are not truth functional connectives. For instance, consider the sentence, if 2 plus 2 equals 4, then Pierre is the capital of South Dakota. Now there I'm using if-then to express the conditional, right? I'm saying if it's true that 2 plus 2 equals 4, then it's true that Pierre is the capital of South Dakota. Now according to the truth table for the conditional, that conditional has got to be true because the first proposition, what we'll call the antecedent, the proposition that occurs right after the if, that antecedent is true. It's true that 2 plus 2 equals 4. And also the consequent, the proposition that occurs right after the then, the consequent is also true. It's true that Pierre is the capital of South Dakota. So, according to the truth table for the conditional, it's going to be true that if 2 plus 2 equals 4, then Pierre is the capital of South Dakota. And now you might worry, wait a second, this is a very strange consequence of the truth table for the conditional. Is it really true that if 2 plus 2 equals 4, then Pierre is the capital of South Dakota? And that's a very baffling thing to say. Now I want to say I completely agree with this objection. It is a baffling thing to say that if 2 plus 2 equals 4, then Pierre is the capital of South Dakota. But just because it's a baffling thing to say doesn't mean it's not true. Look, it's baffling that Pierre is the capital of South Dakota. But baffling as that may be, it's still true that Pierre is the capital of South Dakota. Some things are baffling even though they're true. And this is another example of that general kind of thing. It's baffling, nonetheless true. So, to review, here's what we've done this week. We've learned about some truth-functional connectives, like conjunction, disjunction, and the conditional, and the biconditional. And we've also learned about the truth-functional operator negation. We've looked at the truth tables for these connectives and operators, the truth tables that show how the truth or falsity of the proposition that they can be used to create depends strictly on the truth or falsity of the propositions that they're applied to. And then we've looked at how those truth tables can be used to determine whether and why arguments that employ those truth functional connectives or operators are valid. Now, in order to master the skills that we've learned this week, there's no substitute for practice. And so what I'd like to recommend is that all of you practice the skills that you've learned this week using the resources that are listed. Okay, have fun, and I'll see you next week when we talk about categorical logic and quantifiers. Welcome to week 5 of our course, the week on categorical logic. Remember, last week was on a part of deductive logic that we called propositional logic. Last week we tried to understand why certain inferences, certain arguments that use propositional connectives were valid because of the truth tables for the propositional connectives that they use. This week we're going to be looking at arguments that are valid not because of the propositional connectives that they use,
In fact, a lot of the arguments that we'll be looking at this week have no propositional connectives at all. We'll be looking at arguments that are valid for a different reason. We'll try to understand what that different reason is. But first, to review in more detail what we did last week, let's consider an example of a deductive argument that propositional logic can help us to understand. So, let's look at this. Consider the following argument. Premise 1. Jill is riding her bicycle if and only if John is walking to the park. You can imagine, let's say, that Jill has a bicycle, but the only time she ever rides her bicycle is to meet John at the park. And the only way John ever gets to the park is by walking there. Let's say he lives just a block down from the park, so it doesn't make sense for him to get there any other way. So he only goes to the park by walking there, and Jill only rides her bicycle when she's meeting him at the park. So, according to premise 1, Jill is riding her bicycle if and only if John is walking to the park. Premise 2. John is walking to the park if and only if premise 1 is true. And the conclusion of the argument is, therefore, Jill is riding her bicycle. Now, let me ask you, is that argument valid? Is there any possible way for the premises to be true while the conclusion is false? Well, that's not obvious, is it? It takes a while to see that, in fact, that argument is valid. And the way to see it is by using the truth table for the biconditional, expressed in English by if and only if. We can use the truth table for the biconditional to see that that argument really is valid. Here, let me show you what I have in mind. So look here. There's the proposition Jill is riding her bicycle. Now that proposition could be either true or false. Then there's the proposition John is walking to the park. And of course that proposition could be either true or false. So there are 4 possible combinations. Either Jill is riding her bicycle is true and John is walking to the park is true. Jill is riding her bicycle is true and John is walking to the park is false. Jill is riding her bicycle is false and John is walking to the park is true. Or both of those propositions are false. Those are the 4 possible scenarios. Now, according to premise 1, Jill is riding her bicycle if and only if John is walking to the park. So, if premise 1 is true, that shows us that we're either in the first of those 4 scenarios or the last of those 4 scenarios. We're either in a scenario where it's true that Jill is riding her bicycle and it's true that John is walking to the park, or else we're in a scenario where it's false that Jill is riding her bicycle and it's false that John is walking to the park. Okay, now consider the proposition John is walking to the park if and only if that last statement, the statement to the left, that Jill is riding her bicycle if and only if John is walking to the park, John is walking to the park if and only if that statement is true. Now, what's the truth table for that going to be? Well, the truth table for that is going to be as follows. It's going to be true whenever it's true that John is walking to the park and it's also true that Jill is riding her bicycle if and only if John is walking to the park. It's also going to be true whenever it's false that John is walking to the park and it's false that Jill is riding her bicycle if and only if John is walking to the park. So that means that that last biconditional, that John is walking to the park if and only if premise 1 is true, that's going to be true in the first 2 of our scenarios. It's going to be true when it's true that Jill is riding her bicycle and true that John is walking to the park. It's also going to be true when it's true that Jill is riding her bicycle and false that John is walking to the park. Okay, so now, under what conditions will premise 1 and premise 2 of our argument be both true? Remember, premise 1 says Jill is riding her bicycle if and only if John is walking to the park. Premise 2 says John is walking to the park if and only if premise 1 is true. So under what conditions will those 2 premises be true? Well, those 2 premises will be true only in the first of our 4 scenarios. Because in the first of our 4 scenarios, it'll be true that Jill is riding her bicycle if and only if John is walking to the park.
And in the first of our four scenarios, it'll also be true that John is walking to the park if and only if that last statement, premise one, is also true. So that's the only scenario under which both of those premises are true. But now notice, in that scenario, when both of those premises are true, Jill is riding her bicycle. And so the argument that we just looked at is going to be valid, because in any situation in which the two premises are true, the conclusion is going to have to be true. And we learn that by looking at the truth table for the biconditional. Now, see, that's an example of how we can use the truth table for a propositional connective, like the biconditional, to discover that a particularly tricky argument is valid. Right? We have a tricky deductive argument right here. It's not obvious whether or not it's valid, but we can use the truth table for the biconditional to discover that the argument is valid. But remember, I said we don't just use truth tables to discover when arguments are valid or that they're valid. We can also use truth tables to explain why they're valid, even in cases where they're obviously valid. Right? So last week we looked at lots of examples of arguments that were obviously valid, and in some cases obviously invalid. And we used the truth table not to figure out that they were valid or invalid. It was already obvious that they were valid or invalid, as the case may be. We used the truth table to understand why they were valid or invalid. That's what the truth table was for in those cases. Now, this week, in our study of categorical logic, we want to find a method that can function like the method of truth tables to help us discover whether particular inferences are valid and why particular inferences are valid. But it's not going to be the same as the method of truth tables, because truth tables only work for inferences or arguments that use truth functional connectives. But not every valid argument uses a truth functional connective. Consider a couple of the examples we looked at last week. Consider this argument from a week ago. No fish have wings. All birds have wings. All animals with gills are fish. Therefore, no birds have gills. Is that argument valid? It's not immediately obvious whether or not it's valid, but it turns out that it is valid. And we have a method for proving that it's valid, and this method is what we'll be talking about this week. It's the central method of categorical logic. Notice also that there are other inferences which are obviously valid, but the validity of which truth tables don't help us to understand. Consider, for instance, this example. Mary has a child who is pregnant. Only daughters can become pregnant, therefore Mary has at least one daughter. Now that argument is pretty obviously valid. But why? What is it about the argument that makes it valid? I said at the beginning of week 4 that there's something about the form of the argument, something about the use of the terms only and at least that makes that argument valid. And any argument, no matter what it's about, that uses the terms only and at least in the way that this argument does is also going to be valid. But what is it about the use of those terms that makes the argument valid? Well, this week, in our study of categorical logic, we're going to discover a way of understanding what's going on with that use of those terms, only and at least, those terms that we call quantifiers. We're going to discover a method of understanding quantifiers that can help us to understand why this particular argument and others that are of the same form are valid. Okay, so that's what we'll be doing this week in categorical logic. We'll be understanding how quantifiers work. But what are quantifiers? And after all, if the central words that we're going to be concerned about this week, the central concept this week is the concept of a quantifier, why is this called categorical logic anyway? Why not quantifier logic? Categorical logic is the logic of categories. Quantifiers are words like all, some, none, only, at least, and so forth. What do these things have to do with each other? We'll talk about that in the next lecture.
In the last lecture, I raised the question why it is that we call the subject that we're going to study this week categorical logic, the logic of categories, when really what we're going to be doing is learning about quantifiers. Quantifiers like all, some, none, only, at least, and so forth. What do categories and quantifiers have to do with each other? That's the topic of today's lecture. So, first, let me talk a bit about categories and what role they can play in arguments. Now, frequently we give arguments that make use of categories, of kinds of thing. Consider the following argument. Brazilians speak Portuguese. Portuguese speakers understand Spanish, and therefore Brazilians understand Spanish. Now, there's an argument with two premises and a conclusion, and it's an argument that talks about various categories of thing. One category of thing it talks about is Brazilians. Another category is Portuguese speakers, people who speak Portuguese. And a third category is people who understand Spanish. Okay, now the argument brings those three categories into relation with each other. But how does it do that exactly? What precisely is it that the argument is telling us? Well, here's one interpretation of the argument. You could understand the argument as saying that some Brazilians speak Portuguese. Certainly that's true. Maybe not all Brazilians speak Portuguese, and maybe there are some Brazilian citizens who've only recently acquired citizenship and have never learned to speak Portuguese. So some Brazilians speak Portuguese, that much at least is true. And some Portuguese speakers understand Spanish. Of course, that's true. But suppose the argument concludes from those two premises that some Brazilians understand Spanish. Would that be a valid argument? Well, although I'm confident that the conclusion of that argument is true, the argument itself wouldn't be valid, because there is a way for both premises of the argument to be true while the conclusion is false. Just imagine this. While it's true that some Brazilians speak Portuguese and some Portuguese speakers understand Spanish, you could imagine that all of the Portuguese speakers who do understand Spanish are in Portugal, not in Brazil. Or in any case are in some other part of the world than Brazil. And that none of the Brazilians who speak Portuguese are among the Portuguese speakers who understand Spanish. In that circumstance, the premises could both be true, while the conclusion that some Brazilians understand Spanish would be false. So the argument, even if its conclusion is true, the argument is not valid. But maybe that's not how to understand the argument that we just considered a moment ago, the argument from Brazilians speak Portuguese and Portuguese speakers understand Spanish to Brazilians understand Spanish. Maybe there's a different way to understand the argument. Maybe the right way to understand the argument is as saying this: most Brazilians speak Portuguese. Certainly that's true. And maybe the argument is supposed to say also that most Portuguese speakers understand Spanish. I don't know if that's true, but I gather from people that it's probably true. And maybe the argument intends to draw the conclusion from those two premises that most Brazilians understand Spanish. Now, would that argument be valid? Well, no, it wouldn't. Because even if the conclusion of the argument is true, there's still a possible scenario in which the premises are true while the conclusion is false. I could describe such a scenario to you. Suppose that while most Brazilians do speak Portuguese and most Portuguese speakers do understand Spanish, most Portuguese speakers, let's suppose, live outside Brazil. And the Portuguese speakers who understand Spanish are just those Portuguese speakers who live outside Brazil. So while then it would be true that most Brazilians speak Portuguese and most Portuguese speakers understand Spanish, it might not be true that most Brazilians understand Spanish, because maybe that minority of Portuguese speakers who live in Brazil don't understand Spanish. The only Portuguese speakers who understand Spanish, we could suppose,
are that majority of Portuguese speakers who live outside Brazil. Now, of course, that isn't the actual scenario, but it's a possible scenario. And since it's a possible scenario, there's a possible scenario in which the premises of the argument are true and the conclusion false, and so the argument is not valid. But maybe that's not even the correct way to understand our original argument about Brazilians. Maybe the correct way to understand our original argument is like this. Maybe the argument was intended to say, all Brazilians speak Portuguese, and all Portuguese speakers understand Spanish, therefore, all Brazilians understand Spanish. Now, one thing that this argument has to its credit is that it is valid. If the premises of this argument are true, if it's true that all Brazilians speak Portuguese, and it's true that all Portuguese speakers understand Spanish, then it's got to be true that all Brazilians understand Spanish. So this argument, in contrast to the last two arguments that we looked at, this argument is valid. Unfortunately, it's not sound, because it's almost certainly not the case that the two premises are both true. Be that as it may, though, the argument is valid. Now notice what we did. We started off with an initial argument that used three categories in the argument: the category of Brazilian, the category of Portuguese speaker, and the category of person who understands Spanish. Then we saw that by the use of certain modifiers, the modifiers some, most, or all, we could make that original argument about Brazilians understanding Spanish, we could make that original argument more precise. And once we made it more precise, we could test whether or not it was valid. Okay. Now what I want to introduce is a way of testing whether or not an argument is valid when the argument is one that uses categories and quantifiers to modify those categories. The method involves the use of what we'll call Venn diagrams. A Venn diagram is a diagram that represents a number of different categories. In this simple Venn diagram, we have a representation of the category of Brazilians, and we have a representation of the category of Portuguese speakers. Premise one of our original argument stated a relation between Brazilians and Portuguese speakers. But what relation did it state? Well, that was left vague by the original statement of the argument, but then when we looked at three different ways of making the argument more precise, we saw three different relations that could be stated. It could have said that some Brazilians are Portuguese speakers. The way of representing that would be by drawing an X right here to show that there is something. There is someone who is both a Brazilian and a Portuguese speaker. The second modification we made of the statement said most Brazilians are Portuguese speakers. Now, this week we're not going to discuss a way of representing the quantifier most in Venn diagrams. I just call it to your attention as a quantifier that can be used, and frequently is used, to modify categories in argument. But the third way that we interpreted our original argument about Brazilians understanding Spanish, the third way was as an argument that began by stating that all Brazilians speak Portuguese. Now, how would we represent the fact that all Brazilians speak Portuguese? Well, what are you saying when you say all Brazilians speak Portuguese? Well, you're saying that there is no Brazilian who falls outside the category of Portuguese speakers, right? This circle right here represents the category of Portuguese speakers. And when you say all Brazilians speak Portuguese, what you're saying is that whatever Brazilians there are, they have to be inside this circle. They can't be outside the circle. They've got to be inside the circle of Portuguese speakers. So the way to represent that is to shade out the portion of the Brazilian circle that's outside the Portuguese speaker circle. There, you're indicating that there isn't anything in the Brazilian circle, there isn't anything in the category of Brazilians that falls outside the category of Portuguese speakers. In other words, all Brazilians speak Portuguese. That's how you could represent that. And that's what we're going to do. To represent the statement, all Brazilians speak Portuguese, we simply shade out the part of the Brazilian circle that's outside the Portuguese speaker circle. And to represent some Brazilians speak Portuguese, we put an X in the Brazilian circle that's also inside the Portuguese speaker circle. Now, we used a Venn diagram to represent the information contained in the first premise of the argument about Brazilians. But how could we use a Venn diagram to represent the information contained in both premises and the conclusion? Well, here's how. So, here are three circles corresponding to the categories of Brazilians, Portuguese speakers, and those who understand Spanish. Now, suppose we interpret the first premise of our argument, Brazilians speak Portuguese, as saying that some Brazilians speak Portuguese. Well, as we saw already, the way to represent that is with an X right here that's both in the circle of Brazilians and in the circle of Portuguese speakers. Okay, that represents that there is something, that X, that is both a Brazilian and a Portuguese speaker. Now, how would we represent the information that some Portuguese speakers understand Spanish? Again, we could do that with an X that is both in the circle of Portuguese speakers and in the circle of those who understand Spanish. Right, so that represents that there is something that is both a Portuguese speaker and an understander of Spanish. But now notice, we've represented the information that some Brazilians speak Portuguese and some Portuguese speakers understand Spanish. Now, does that information imply that some Brazilians understand Spanish? If the information that some Brazilians are Portuguese speakers and some Portuguese speakers understand Spanish, if that information is true, does it follow from that some Brazilians understand Spanish? Well, one look at this diagram should tell us that no, it doesn't follow. Because look here. Right, you have a thing that is a Brazilian and a Portuguese speaker, representing the fact that some Brazilians speak Portuguese. Then you have a thing that is a Portuguese speaker and understands Spanish, representing the fact that some Portuguese speakers understand Spanish. But do you have anything that is both a Brazilian and something that understands Spanish? No, not necessarily. So this diagram right here shows you that if the premises of our argument are some Brazilians are Portuguese speakers and some Portuguese speakers understand Spanish, from those premises it doesn't follow that some Brazilians understand Spanish. If you want to conclude that some Brazilians understand Spanish, your argument is not going to be valid. There's going to be a possible scenario in which the premises of your argument are true and the conclusion is false. And so we can say about this argument right here that this argument is not valid. And we can understand why it's not valid by looking at this Venn diagram right here. That shows why our argument about some Brazilians being Portuguese speakers, why that argument is not valid. Okay, but now let's consider not the argument to the effect that some Brazilians speak Portuguese. Let's consider the argument to the effect that all Brazilians speak Portuguese. How would we represent the information in those premises and that conclusion? Well, if all Brazilians speak Portuguese, what that means is that all of the Brazilians must be inside the category of Portuguese speakers. So there can't be any Brazilians outside that category. Okay, so we can shade out the portion of the Brazilian circle that's outside the category of Portuguese speakers. We know there's nothing in there because all the Brazilians there are inside the category of Portuguese speaker according to premise 1 of this new argument. Right? According to premise 1, all Brazilians are Portuguese speakers. According to that premise, all the Brazilians there are
have to be in here. Okay, premise 2 says, all Portuguese speakers understand Spanish. Okay, well, if all Portuguese speakers understand Spanish, then there cannot be any Portuguese speakers who are outside the category of those who understand Spanish, right? Here's the category of those who understand Spanish. And all the Portuguese speakers, according to premise 2, have to be inside that circle. So that means that we can shade out the portion of the Portuguese speaker circle that's outside the understand Spanish circle, right? There are no Portuguese speakers that fall outside the category of understanders of Spanish, according to premise 2 of this argument, right? That all Portuguese speakers understand Spanish. So now we can represent that information that way. Okay, now that we've represented the information contained in those two premises, all Brazilians speak Portuguese and all Portuguese speakers understand Spanish, let's ask, does it follow from those two premises that all Brazilians understand Spanish? Well, let's see. Yes, it does. What Brazilians can there be? There can't be any out here, and there can't be any in here, and of course there can't be any in here either. The only Brazilians there can be are these in here. That's the only part of the Brazilian circle that is left unshaded once we shaded in the circles that we had to shade in to represent the first two premises of the argument. Right? Once we shaded in the part of the Brazilian circle that we had to shade in order to represent the premise that all Brazilians were Portuguese speakers, and then we also shaded in the Portuguese speaker circle outside the understanders of Spanish circle, the only part of the Brazilian circle that's left unshaded is this, which means that whatever Brazilians there are have to be in here. So if there are any Brazilians at all, they've got to understand Spanish because they're in the circle of things that understand Spanish. Therefore, all Brazilians understand Spanish. And we've just used this Venn diagram to prove visually that our argument is valid. This argument back here is valid. And our three-circle Venn diagram shows that it's valid. In the last lecture, I said that quantifiers modify categories. That's how quantifiers and categories are related to each other. Categories are kinds of things, and quantifiers modify categories. They can modify them in different ways. There are different kinds of quantifiers. In today's lecture, we'll talk about some of the different kinds of quantifiers and how they modify categories. We'll also talk about how the representation of these different quantifiers differs both verbally and visually using the Venn diagram. Okay, so what are the different kinds of quantifiers? Well, here are some of the different kinds of quantifiers. There's the quantifier all, and we can apply this to categories. Notice, by the way, in this slide, I'm using an uppercase F and an uppercase G to represent any category at all. So in a statement of the form all F's are G's, that's the claim that all things that fall into one category, never mind exactly what that category is, let's just call it F, also fall into a second category. Again, never mind what that category is, we can just call it G. There are lots of examples of this kind of claim. When you say all things of one category also fall into a second category, for instance, all dogs are mammals, all squares are rectangles, all Coursera students are human, and so on. In all of these cases, you're making a claim of the form that all things that fall into one category, the F category, also fall into the G category. So all is one kind of quantifier, and any statement of the form all F's are G's, we're going to call a statement of type A, a proposition of type A. Then there's the quantifier no, which we can use in a statement of the form no F's are G's. No things of one category also fall into a second category.
So, for instance, you might say, no humans are reptile. No Coursera students are trees. No democracies are at war. So they're examples of statements of the form that we're going to call E. An E statement is a statement to the effect that no things that fall into one category also fall into a second category. Then there's the quantifier some. Now, the quantifier some can be used to make statements of two very different kinds. You could say that some things that fall into one category also fall into a second category. So if you'd said, some humans are female, some Coursera students are American, some Americans speak Spanish, right? Those are statements to the effect that some things falling into one category, the F's, also fall into a second category, the G's. Some F's are G's. Propositions of that form we'll call I propositions. Finally, we could also use the quantifier some to make a different kind of statement, a statement to the effect that some things that fall into one category don't fall into a second category. Right? Some humans are not female. Some Coursera students are not American. Some Americans are not Spanish speakers. Statements of that form we'll call O statements or O propositions, right? They say that some things that fall into one category don't fall into a second category. Some F's are not G's. So those are the four kinds of statements we're going to focus on in this week on categorical logic. We'll consider other kinds of statements as well, and we'll mention some other kinds of quantifiers, but those are the ones that are going to be of primary interest to us. Now, I've talked about these different quantifiers and how they can be used to make statements of very different kinds. But now we can visually represent the differences in the information provided in these four different kinds of statements. So consider, how would we visually represent a statement of the form that all F's are G's? All things that fall into one category also fall into a second category. Well, if you wanted to say all F's are G's, let's see, how would you do that? You'd be saying that all of the F's that there are fall into the G circle. But if all the F's that there are fall into the G circle, then there can't be any F's outside the G circle, right? So the Venn diagram for all F's or G's would look like that. Right? You'd be saying whatever F's there are, they've got to be in here. Right? There can't be any outside there. So that would be the Venn diagram for all F's or G's, or a proposition of the A form. Next, there are propositions of the E form. Now, how would we represent those? Well, let's see. Here's the Venn diagram for no F's or G's. When you say no F's or G's, you're saying if there are any F's at all, they can't be inside the G circle. So you've got to shade out that portion of the F circle that's inside the G circle, right? The shading implies that there's nothing there, right? So there are no F's inside the G circle. And that's how you represent no F's or G's. Next, there are statements of the I form, some F's or G's. How would you represent those? Some F's or G's, you use an X mark to represent that there is a thing. So you use an X to represent that there is a thing that's in the F circle and that's also in the G circle, right? So there's a thing right there. It's in the F circle, so it is an F, but it's also a G. So some F's are G's. That's how you'd visually represent a statement of the I form. Now finally, how about a statement of the O form? Some F's are not G's. How would you visually represent that? Well, you'd have to make an X to indicate that there is an F, right? There is a thing that is F, but it's not G. If it's not G, then it's got to be outside the G circle. So it's inside the F circle,
but outside the G circle. Right? And that's how you'd indicate visually some F's are not G's. Now, I'd like you to notice something. We've just gone over the Venn diagrams for propositions of the A, E, I, and O forms. But what I'd like you to notice, let's go back to those forms. Propositions of the A form, all F's are G's, are negations of propositions of the O form, some F's are not G's. Right? If all F's are G's, then it's not going to be true that some F's are not G's. And if some F's are not G's, then it's not going to be true that all F's are G's. All F's are G's, in other words, is going to be true when, and only when, some F's are not G's is not true. And similarly, propositions of the E form are going to be negations of propositions of the I form. Right? When is it going to be true that no F's are G's? It's going to be true that no F's are G's when, and only when, it's not true that some F's are G's. Right? If some F's are G's, then it's not going to be true that no F's are G's. And if no F's are G's, then it's not going to be true that some F's are G's. So, propositions of the A and O form are negations of each other, and propositions of the E and I form are negations of each other. And those relationships are represented visually on the Venn diagrams that we just drew. Right? Consider again the Venn diagram for propositions of the A form. Propositions of the A form, the Venn diagram is going to have shading in here, but in propositions of the O form, the Venn diagram is going to have an X in here, in precisely the place where propositions of the A form had shading. Propositions of the E form are going to have shading in here, whereas propositions of the I form are going to have an X in here. So the way that we represent negation using Venn diagrams is one proposition is going to be the negation of another just in case the first has shading wherever the second has an X, or vice versa. Right? If one proposition has an X wherever the other has shading, or it has shading wherever the other has an X, then the two propositions are going to be the negations of each other. That's how the relation of negation is visually represented in Venn diagrams. In the last lecture, we learned about propositions of the forms that we labeled A, E, I, and O. We learned how to represent these propositions verbally and also how to represent them visually using Venn diagrams. Today, I want to apply those lessons to study a kind of argument that we're going to call an immediate categorical inference. So, what's an immediate categorical inference? An immediate categorical inference is an inference with just one premise, and of course one conclusion, where each of those two statements, both the premise and the conclusion, are of the form A, E, I, or O. They needn't be of the same form. One of them could be, let's say, of the E form and the other one of the O form, or whatever. They needn't be of the same form, but they're each of one of those four forms. Now, these are very simple inferences, but we're going to study them today because we're going to see how we can use Venn diagrams to show that some of these inferences are valid and others aren't. Now, before we do that, let me say something about the kinds of propositions that are involved in these inferences, the A, E, I, and O propositions. Remember what those letters stand for. The A proposition is a proposition of the form all F's are G's. All things that fall into one category also fall into a second category. An E proposition is a proposition of the form no F's or G's. Nothing that falls into the first category also falls into the second category. An I proposition is a proposition of the form some F's or G's. That's to say something that falls into the first category falls into the second category. And an O proposition is a proposition of the form some F's are not G's. Right? Something that falls into the first category does not fall into the second category. Now notice, in each of those propositions, there's one category that I'm indicating by use of the schematic letter F. There's one category that gets directly modified by the quantifier right? The F category, right? I'm talking about, in the A proposition, I'm talking about all things that fall into that category. In the E proposition, I'm talking about no things that fall into that category. In the I or the O proposition, I'm talking about some things that fall into that category. So there's a category that gets directly modified by the quantifier, and then there's another category that doesn't. Okay, let's introduce terminology to distinguish these two categories. We'll talk about the two categories as the subject term and the predicate term. So the category that gets directly modified by the quantifier, the F category, is what we're going to call the subject term. And the category that doesn't get directly modified by the quantifier is what we're going to call the predicate term. You'll see in our later lecture about syllogisms why this terminology is going to be useful. It's not going to be obvious today why it's useful, but it'll eventually become useful. Okay, so F's are subject terms, G's are predicate terms, and immediate categorical inferences are inferences that have one premise with a subject term and a predicate term, and one conclusion with a subject term and a predicate term. All right. What kinds of immediate categorical inferences are there? Well, there are lots, but the most common kind of immediate categorical inference is one that we'll call conversion. A conversion inference is an inference in which the conclusion just switches the subject term and predicate term as they occur in the premise. So if the premise is of the form no F's or G's, let's say no Duke students are NFL football players, then the conclusion would be of the form no G's or F's. No NFL football players are Duke students. That's an example of an immediate categorical inference that's a conversion inference. It converts one E proposition to another E proposition. You could do it for other forms of propositions. So for instance, consider the conversion inference from an A proposition to another A proposition. Consider the inference from all Duke students are NFL football players to the conclusion all NFL football players are Duke students. Now notice, the first of those two conversion inferences is plausibly valid, whereas the second one isn't. Why is that? Well, we can see why that is if we use Venn diagrams to visually represent the information contained in the premises of those inferences. More generally, I can say right now that conversion inferences are valid for propositions of the E and I form, but they're not valid for propositions of the A or O form. We can understand why that is using Venn diagrams, right? So why is it that conversion inferences from the A form to the A form are not valid? Why are they not valid? Well, let's consider. What are you saying when you say all F's or G's? Well, you're saying that whatever F's there are, they're not outside the G circle. They're all in the G circle. So you represent that information by shading in the portion of the F circle that's outside the G circle in order to indicate that there's nothing there. Okay, but now once you've shaded in that portion of the F circle, does that tell you that all G's are F's? No. Of course, it leaves open that all G's are F's. I mean, it could be that all the G's there are in here, but shading in the portion of the F circle that's outside the G circle also leaves it open that there are plenty of G's out here. So once we look at the Venn diagram from the inference for all F's or G's to all G's or F's, we understand why that inference is not valid. Right? Shading in the portion of the F circle outside the G circle leaves open that there are plenty of G's that are outside the F circle. Okay, what about the second kind of conversion inference for propositions of the E form, from no F's or G's to no G's or F's? Well, let's see. How would we represent no F's or G's? Well, we do that by shading in the portion of the F circle that's inside the G circle, right? So that shows that no F's are in the G circle, no F's or G's. But now look, if no F's or G's, then we can just read off from that no G's or F's, right? If there are any G's, they can't be in the area that's shaded in, right? Because what it means to shade in the area is that there's nothing there. So whatever G's there are, they can't be inside the F circle. They've got to be outside the F circle. So if it's true that no F's or G's, then it's got to be true that no G's or F's. The Venn diagram for no F's or G's shows us that. So conversion inferences are invalid for A propositions, but they're valid for E propositions. What about I propositions? Well, let's see. I propositions have the form some F's or G's. Well, how would we represent some F's or G's? We would indicate that there is something that's inside the F circle. It's an F, but it's also a G. It's in the G circle. We'd indicate it with an X. Okay, but notice, once we indicate by means of that X that there's something inside the F circle that's also inside the G circle, you can just read off from that there's something inside the G circle that's also inside the F circle. In other words, some G's or F's. So, once again, from the Venn diagram, you can see that if some F's or G's is true, then some G's or F's has got to be true. In other words, the conversion inference for an I proposition has got to be valid. Okay, finally, what about O propositions? Some F's are not G's. Well, let's see. Some F's are not G's. How would you diagram that? Well, some F's, so you want to use an X to indicate that there is an F, but it's not a G, so it's got to be outside the G circle. So there, you draw an X that's inside the F circle to show that it is an F, but it's outside the G circle, so it's not a G. That's how you represent that some F's are not G's. Okay, now does that imply that some G's are not F? No. Maybe there are no G's at all for all that you've just been told, right? You're told that some F's are not G. That doesn't tell you that there are any G's. Or if there are any G's, maybe all the G's are in here. You don't know whether there are any G's in here. So, from the premise that some F's are not G's, you can't infer that some G's are not F. It doesn't follow that some G's are not F. And the Venn diagram shows us why. So this last conversion inference on propositions of the O form is not valid. And once again, you can see that from the Venn diagram for propositions of the O form. So this shows how Venn diagrams, simple two-circle Venn diagrams, can be used to establish the validity or invalidity of immediate categorical inferences. Okay, next time we'll consider inferences of a more complicated kind. See you next time.
In the last class, we talked about immediate categorical inferences, which are inferences that have a single premise and a conclusion, where each of those two propositions is of the A, E, I, or O form. Today, we're going to talk about a new kind of inference called a syllogism. So what's a syllogism? Here's a definition. A syllogism is an argument that has two premises and a conclusion, where all three of those propositions are of the form A, E, I, or O. Now, the conclusion is going to have two categories in it. One category that's modified by a quantifier, and we're going to call that the subject category. The other category is not modified by a quantifier. We're going to call that the predicate category. Now, the subject category is what we call the subject term of the syllogism. The predicate category, the category that's not modified by a quantifier in the conclusion, that's what we're going to call the predicate term of the syllogism. Now, every syllogism is going to have a premise that includes the subject term and another premise that includes the predicate term. Now, the premise that includes the subject term is what we're going to call the minor premise of the syllogism, and the premise that includes the predicate term is what we're going to call the major premise of the syllogism. So every syllogism is going to have two premises, where one premise is the minor premise, and it's going to include the subject term of the syllogism, which is the category that's modified by the quantifier in the conclusion of the syllogism, and the other premise is the major premise of the syllogism. It includes the predicate term of the syllogism, which is the category that's not modified by a quantifier in the conclusion of the syllogism. Okay, now let's look at how we can use Venn diagrams to represent the information that's carried by syllogisms, and so to assess whether or not a particular syllogism is valid. In order to visually represent the information that's given in the syllogism, we need to use a Venn diagram with three circles, not just two circles, because in the syllogism we have three categories. We have the subject term, the subject category, the middle term, the G's, and the predicate term, the H's. So we need to get a Venn diagram with all three of those circles to represent the information contained in the syllogism. Now, I've described all this very abstractly. Let me give some examples so you can see how this works and how we can use Venn diagrams like this to figure out whether or not syllogisms are valid and to explain why they're valid. Okay. So consider this syllogism. All Duke students are humans. All humans are animals. Therefore, all Duke students are animals. Okay. Valid or not? Well, pretty obviously it is valid. But a Venn diagram could help us to understand why it's valid. So let's diagram the information contained in the premises. So the first premise, recall, was that all Duke students are humans. Well, if we want to show that all Duke students are humans, that's to say that whatever Duke students there are have got to be inside the circle of the humans. So this region of the Duke student circle, this region of the circle that's outside the circle of the humans, we can shade that in to indicate that there's nothing there. Right? Nothing here, because whatever Duke students there are have got to be in this region. Okay, the second premise said that all humans are animals. Well, if all humans are animals, then what that tells us is that whatever humans there are have got to be inside the circle of the animals. So we can shade in the portion of the human circle that's outside the animal circle, right? Because there aren't any humans out there. So shade that in. Okay, but now we look at the diagram with those regions shaded in, and what can we conclude? Well, we can conclude that whatever Duke students there are have got to be in this region right here. That's the only region where there could be any Duke students given the two premises of our argument. In other words, all Duke students are animals. And that's just the conclusion of our syllogism, remember? All Duke students are animals. So we just used the Venn diagram to explain why this syllogism, which is obviously valid, is valid. We explained why it is valid. It is valid because when you shade in the portion of the Duke student circle that's outside the human circle, and you shade in the portion of the human circle that's outside the animal circle, the only place left over in the Duke student circle for there to be any Duke students is inside the animal circle. And so all Duke students are animals, as we all know. Now, here's a second syllogism. Let's consider this one. Some Duke students are humans. All humans are animals. Therefore, some Duke students are animals. Valid or not? Well, let's see. So, some Duke students are humans. How would we represent that information? Some Duke students are humans. What that means is that there's got to be something in this part of the circle of Duke students that's also in the circle of humans. But the first premise doesn't tell us where that thing would be. Would it be here or would it be here? Well, let's hedge our bets and draw it right here, since we don't know. We'll draw it on the borderline of the animal circle, since the first premise doesn't yet tell us whether it's here or here. Okay. And the second premise said all humans are animals. Okay, well, if all humans are animals,
What that tells us is that there aren't any humans outside the animal circle. So we can just shade in the part of the human circle that's outside the animal circle. Right? Shade it in right there. But then notice, remember we had to have an X inside our Duke student circle and our human circle inside the intersection. Well, it can't be in here because this is shaded in, which means there's nothing there. So the only place it can be is right there. So now we know that the X had to be over here. But once we put the X over there, which we have to, given the information in the two premises of our syllogism, what can we conclude? We can conclude that some Duke students are animals. And that's exactly what the conclusion of the syllogism is that some Duke students are animals. Finally, that should say example 3, not example 1. Finally, consider this syllogism. No Duke students are humans. All humans are animals. Therefore, no Duke students are animals. Okay, now how would we represent that using the Venn diagram? Well, no Duke students are humans. So that means that we have to shade in the portion of the Duke student circle that's inside the human circle to show that there's nothing in there, right? None of the Duke students are humans. Okay, all humans are animals, so that means we have to shade in the portion of the human circle that's outside the animal circle, right? Because there are no humans out there. All humans are animals. Right? And the conclusion was that no Duke students are animals. But wait a second. You can't read that off the diagram. There could be lots of Duke students over here who are animals. There could be all sorts of Duke students who are animals right there. They wouldn't be human, but there could still be plenty of Duke students that are animals. In other words, this third syllogism is not valid. And it's not valid for a reason that's made clear by the Venn diagram that we just looked at. The Venn diagram shows us that and explains why the inference, the syllogism, is not valid. Just because no Duke students are humans and all humans are animals, it doesn't follow that no Duke students are animals. Those premises leave it open that there are plenty of animal Duke students. They just wouldn't be the humans. So, in this lecture, I've tried to show how we can use Venn diagrams to predict that and to explain why syllogisms are valid or invalid, as the case may be. Next time, we'll apply these lessons to some examples that we've already looked at before, but that we weren't treating as syllogisms when we looked at them before. See you next time. In the last few lectures, we've seen how we can use Venn diagrams to predict that and to show why, explain why, certain immediate categorical inferences and certain syllogisms are valid or invalid. Now, I'd like to make a point today about categorical logic, about categories in general. It might seem that the application of the method of Venn diagrams is really quite limited because a lot of our statements aren't really about categories at all. They're about individuals, not categories. But I want to say that this is an example of how ordinary language can mislead us. If we think about precisely what it is that we're saying in a lot of the ordinary statements that appear to be about individuals, we'll see that, in fact, those ordinary statements really are about categories, not just about individuals. Let me give you an example to illustrate this point. Consider the statement, Mary owns a Ferrari. Now, that statement appears to be just about individuals. It doesn't appear to involve any categories, right? There's Mary, who, let's suppose, is a particular person that I'm talking about, like a coworker of mine. Not that any of my coworkers would own a Ferrari, but suppose that Mary is a particular person, and we're talking about Mary's Ferrari, which is a particular car, and
it seems that that statement is just claiming that the person, the particular person I'm talking about, owns that particular car. Right? There don't seem to be any categories involved at all. But wait a second. Compare the statement Mary owns a Ferrari to the statement some of Mary's possessions are Ferrari cars. Now that second statement, notice, is of the I form. It's of the form some F's are G's. Right? You're saying some things that fall into one category, the category of Mary's possessions, also fall into a second category, the category of Ferrari cars. Now, these two statements seem to amount to the same thing. When I say Mary owns a Ferrari, what I'm saying is true if and only if some of Mary's possessions are Ferrari cars. The information carried by one of those statements seems to be the same as the information carried by the other. So here's a case where, to look at the language we were using when we said Mary owns a Ferrari, you would have thought, well, we're not talking about any categories there. So the method of Venn diagrams and all of this stuff about categorical logic is completely irrelevant to any argument we might make that uses the statement Mary owns a Ferrari, either as a premise or as a conclusion. But in fact, that's not true. In fact, the statement that Mary owns a Ferrari is equivalent to the statement some of Mary's possessions are Ferrari cars, which is a statement of the I form, some F's or G's. And so, the categorical logic that we've been developing this week in the method of Venn diagrams actually can be used to study the validity of arguments where the statement Mary owns a Ferrari is included as one of the premises or as the conclusion. Because the statement Mary owns a Ferrari is just equivalent to a statement of the I form. Some of Mary's possessions are Ferrari cars. I want to say this phenomenon is very general. Not every statement is of the A, E, I, or O forms, but lots and lots of ordinary statements that we make are of one of those forms. Many more than ordinary language would suggest. So, with that in mind, I want now to show how we can apply the categorical logic, how we can apply the lessons we learned concerning the validity of syllogisms, and how we can use Venn diagrams to predict and explain the validity of syllogisms, how we can now apply those lessons to arguments that are syllogisms, but you wouldn't think that they are just to look at the language in which they're expressed. Okay, see you next time. Today, we're going to talk about how you can use Venn diagrams to show that a particular inference is valid, and to explain why it's valid. We're going to do that by considering the particular inferences, the particular arguments that we looked at the beginning of last week when we were starting our unit on deductive logic. So let's look at those inferences right now. Remember, the first one was the example that Walter gave back in week 3, our argument about Mary. Premise 1 was Mary has a child who is pregnant. Premise 2 was only daughters can become pregnant. And so the conclusion of those two premises was, therefore, Mary has at least one daughter. Okay, now, how do we represent the information contained in the premises of this inference using a Venn diagram? Well, let's begin by asking, what are the categories that this inference, that this argument brings into relation with each other? Is Mary one of the categories? Well, no, because Mary's not a category. Mary's an object. Mary's a thing. She's a particular thing. She's not a category. What is a category, though, that's mentioned in this argument is Mary's children. And the information in the first premise is that the category of Mary's children
includes something that is also in the category of pregnant people or pregnant beings. So we can visually represent that information as follows. The category of Mary's children includes something that's in the category of pregnant people. Right? So we don't know whether or not the category of Mary's children includes anything out here, but whether or not it includes anything out here, it's got to include something that's in this region. So do we draw an X? Well, let's wait a minute. Let's ask, where would we draw that X? Would we draw it here? Or would we draw it here? That's going to make a difference. That's going to make a difference where we draw it. So we don't yet know whether to draw the X in here or in here. We know, though, that the X is supposed to go somewhere in this football-shaped region that's in the intersection of the category of Mary's children and the category of pregnant people. Maybe premise 2 will help us figure out where to draw that X. Let's see. So premise 2 says only daughters can become pregnant. So how do we visually represent the information that only daughters can become pregnant? Well, only daughters can become pregnant means that there can't be any pregnant people who are not daughters. So we have to shade out the circle, the portion of the circle of pregnant people that's outside the circle of daughters. Right? There can't be any pregnant people who are outside this circle. All the pregnant people are inside this circle. Okay, but remember, what did premise 1 tell us? Premise 1 told us that Mary has a child who's inside this circle. So here's what we know. Mary has a child who's inside the circle of pregnant people, and anyone who's inside the circle of pregnant people must also be inside the circle of daughters. Well, so Mary's child, who's inside the pregnant people circle, must be right here. So that's where the X goes. So what we can figure out from just the first 2 premises, remember, I haven't relied on any information here other than the information given in premises 1 and 2. What premises 1 and 2 tell us is that there's an X and it goes right here. Okay, but if the X goes right there, then what does that tell us? That tells us that at least one of Mary's children is a daughter. Mary has at least one daughter. Maybe she has more than one daughter, but we know, based on the information contained in premises 1 and 2, we can conclude that she has at least one daughter. We know that for sure based on the information contained in premises 1 and 2. So, if the information contained in premises 1 and 2 is correct, then Mary must have at least one daughter. And so the argument is valid. And the Venn diagram shows us that the argument is valid, because once we visually represent the information contained in premises 1 and 2, then we can simply read off the diagram that the conclusion is true. We can read off the diagram that Mary has at least one daughter. Okay, now let's see if we can apply this technique to the other arguments of the same form that we considered at the beginning of last week. Remember, we considered an argument concerning Terry. Premise 1 was, Terry has a job in which she arrests people. Premise 2 was, only police officers can arrest people. And the conclusion of those 2 premises was, therefore, at least one of Terry's jobs is as a police officer. Now, how would we visually represent the information contained in the premises? Well, let's consider. Premise 1 tells us that Terry's jobs includes a job in which she arrests people. Right? So at least one of Terry's jobs has to be in this circle. Because whatever else it is that Terry does, she has a job in which she arrests people. So at least one of her jobs must be in this circle. And of course, it has to be in this circle because that's the circle of Terry's jobs. So at least one of Terry's jobs must be in this football-shaped region right here, in this intersection of the category of Terry's jobs and professionals who arrest people. That's what premise 1 tells us. But again, it doesn't tell us where that particular job of Terry's would be. Is it here or is it here? Right? Premise 1 doesn't give us that information. But what does premise 2 tell us? Well, remember, premise 2 tells us that only police officers can arrest people. So, how would we visually represent that? Only police officers can arrest people. That means that there's, in the circle of professionals who arrest people, we have to shade in this part because there are no professionals who arrest people other than police officers. Only police officers arrest people. So we shade in that portion of the professionals who arrest people circle. And now remember what we learned from premise 1 was that Terry has a job in which she arrests people. So somewhere in this football-shaped region, there has to be an X. But we know now that it can't be here. So the X must be here. So that's the information that we get from premises 1 and 2. But notice, once we visually represent that information in our Venn diagram, then we can simply read off the Venn diagram that Terry has a job, at least one job, in which she's a police officer. So at least one of Terry's jobs is as a police officer. And we can just read that off the Venn diagram once we've used the Venn diagram to represent the information contained in premises 1 and 2. So the Venn diagram, again, can be used to represent the validity of the inference. And not only that, notice also that the Venn diagram for this inference is the same in the placement of its shading and its X's as the Venn diagram for the previous inference about Mary. Well, what does that tell us? That tells us that the two inferences, the two arguments, are of the same form. They're of the same form, and you can see that by seeing that their Venn diagrams look the same. The only difference between the two Venn diagrams is the labeling of the circles, is the categories, the specific categories involved in the arguments. Other than the specific categories involved in the arguments, the labeling of the circles, everything else is the same. The shading is in the same place, the X is in the same place. Okay, now, can we apply this to our third argument about Robert? You'll remember this third argument that we considered of the same form at the beginning of week 4, at the beginning of our unit on deductive logic. Remember, we considered an argument that went like this. Premise 1, Robert has a pet who is canine. Premise 2, only mammals are canine. Conclusion, therefore, at least one of Robert's pets is mammal. Okay, well, how would we visually represent the information contained in premises 1 and 2 of this argument? Here's how. At least one of Robert's pets is canine. So that means that whatever other pets Robert has, right? Maybe Robert has some non-canine pets, but at least one of Robert's pets must be in this circle. Well, that particular pet that we're talking about has to be in this circle, but of course it also has to be in this circle because this is the circle of Robert's pets. So the pet must be in this football-shaped region right here, the intersection of Robert's pets and canines. But where is it? Is it here or is it here? Well, now let's look at premise 2. What do we find out from premise 2? What we find out from premise 2 is that only mammals are canine. Okay, well, if only mammals are canine, then that means that there can't be any canines outside the circle of mammals, right? All the canines, whatever canines there are in this region right here. There aren't any canines outside the mammal circle. So, we know that whatever canines there are have to be in this intersection right here of the circle of canines and the circle of mammals. And we also know that whatever
that Robert has at least one pet in the circle of canines. Okay, well, if Robert has a pet in the circle of canines, and we also know that there's nothing in the circle of canines that's over here, then we know that Robert's pet, which has to be in this circle, right? This is the circle of Robert's pets. Robert's pet has got to be in here, right? The pet that we're talking about, the pet that's canine, has got to be in there. Okay, so that's a way of visually representing the information contained in the two premises of our argument. But once we visually represent that information, we can just look at the diagram and read off the fact that at least one of Robert's pets is mammal. Because at least one of Robert's pets is inside the circle of mammals, right? Inside this circle, which means that at least one of Robert's pets is mammal. But that's exactly what the conclusion says. And so this Venn diagram shows us that this argument about Robert is valid, just as the arguments about Mary and Terry were valid. And furthermore, this argument about Robert is valid for the same reason as the arguments about Mary and Terry were valid. They're valid not because of their subject matter, right? The three arguments have completely different subject matters. They're valid because of their form, and their form is what's revealed by the Venn diagram. The form is what's in common to the three Venn diagrams. The placement of shading and X's in the Venn diagrams is their common form, and that's what explains why all three of the arguments are valid. Okay, see you next time. In the last few lectures, we've seen how we can use Venn diagrams to visually represent the information that's conveyed in A, E, I, or O propositions. And we've also seen how there are different ways in ordinary language of expressing such propositions. Sometimes such propositions are expressed even by sentences that use individuals' names and don't explicitly mention categories. Today, I want to talk a bit more about that. I want to talk about the various ways in which, in English at least, and in many other natural languages, we can represent the information conveyed by A, E, I, or O propositions using forms of language that we haven't yet discussed. So, let's consider some examples. So consider propositions of the form not all F's or G's. We haven't talked about not all before. Well, when you say not all F's or G's, what exactly are you saying? Usually, when you say not all F's or G's, what you mean to be saying is that there are some F's that are not G's. In short, what you mean to be saying when you say not all F's or G's is usually a proposition of the O form. So, how would you represent not all F's or G's? Well, all F's or G's, remember, would be represented by shading this out. That would be all F's or G's, but you're saying not all F's or G's. In other words, some F's are not G. So instead of shade there, what you would do is put an X right there. There's some F, something out there, that's not a G. It's outside the category of the G's. And for some examples, you might say, not all geniuses take Coursera courses. In other words, some geniuses don't take Coursera courses. Or you might say, not everything that Pat does is intended to annoy Chris. In other words, some of the things that Pat does, some of the things that fall into the category things that Pat does, are intended to annoy Chris. That is to say, they do fall into the category things that are intended to annoy Chris. So those are both examples of statements of the form not all F's or G's, and they're both equivalent to a statement of the form some F's are not G's. Now consider statements of the form all F's are not G's. Well, when you say something of the form all F's are not G's, that's usually intended to convey that no F's are G's. In other words, it's usually intended to convey a proposition of the E form. So when you say no F's or G's, how do you represent that? Well, you represent it by shading in the intersection of the F's and the G's. And that's just to say that all F's are not G's, right? If there are any F's at all, they've got to be out here. They've got to be outside the category of the G's. Some examples of statements like that. All Nobel Prize winners are not alcoholics. Right? You're saying if there are any Nobel Prize winners, they're outside the category of the alcoholics. Everything that Pat does is not designed to achieve victory. Again, you're saying that whatever falls into the category of things that Pat does, it is outside the category of things designed to achieve victory. Okay, so if this is the category of Pat's actions, and this is the category of things designed to achieve victory, then when you say everything that Pat does is not designed to achieve victory, you're saying there's nothing in this intersection. Whatever Pat's actions are, they've got to be out here. Okay, finally, let's consider a statement of the form some F's are both G's and H's. If you say some F's are both G's and H's, what are you saying? Well, are you saying that there are some F's that are G's and some F's that are H's? Well, that's something you could say, of course. You could say some F's are G's and some F's are H's, right? You could say some men are tall and some men are short. But when you say some F's are both G's and H's, you're not saying that. You're saying that some F's are in this intersection of G's and H's, right? So some F's have got to be here. That's what you're saying when you say some F's are both G's and H's, right? That's why you couldn't say, at least you couldn't truthfully say, some men are both tall and short, right? There's no man who is both tall and short. But you could say there are some men who are both wealthy and happy. Then they're a man who is wealthy and who is happy. Other examples, some philosophers are both robotic and monotone. Right? It's not just that there are some philosophers who are robotic and some philosophers who are monotone. There are actually some philosophers who are both robotic and monotone. Some of the things that Pat does are both intended to amuse and to provoke. Right? It's not just that some of the things she does are intended to amuse and some of the things she does are intended to provoke. It's that some of the things she does are intended to do both amuse and to provoke. So, right, if these are Pat's actions right here, and this is the category of things intended to amuse, and this is the category of things intended to provoke, then this last statement, some of the things that Pat does are both intended to amuse and to provoke, is saying that some of Pat's actions fall into this area right here, this intersection of things designed to amuse and things designed to provoke. But of course, since they're Pat's actions, they have to fall into this portion of the area, right here. Okay, I hope I've given you a sense of the various ways in which ordinary language can express ideas that we can represent visually using Venn diagrams. Over the past couple of weeks, we've seen how we can use truth tables and Venn diagrams to predict and explain the validity of arguments. But the arguments that we've looked at are all arguments that are given in ordinary language that we can understand. But of course, not all arguments are like that. Some arguments are given in foreign languages that we don't understand, or they're given in technical languages that we don't understand. Could you use truth tables or Venn diagrams to predict and explain the validity of those arguments? Even those arguments that are given in languages that you don't yet understand? Well, today I'm going to show you that you can. You can do that. And I'm going to show it by giving some examples. So let's start with a simple but fanciful example.
So suppose you're an anthropologist, you're a cultural anthropologist, you're studying some foreign culture, and you're trying to translate their language because their language has been heretofore untranslated. So you go in and you're translating their language, you're figuring out what they mean by various words that they use. And you've translated most of their words, but there's this word they use, spoog, and you haven't yet figured out what that means. And so you're observing their behavior, and finally you come up with a hypothesis. And you're pretty confident of this hypothesis. Your hypothesis is that they use spoog as a truth functional connective. And it's a truth functional connective that has this truth table. It connects two propositions to make a larger proposition, and that resulting proposition, P spoog Q, for whatever propositions P and Q spoog is connecting, that resulting proposition is going to be true whenever P is true or whenever both P and Q are false. So the only scenario in which P spoog Q is going to be false is where P is false and Q is true. So that's your hypothesis about what they mean by spoog. Okay, now one day you hear one of the members of this foreign culture give an argument. And using the translation manual that you've developed, you translate their argument as follows. John is riding his bicycle. Spoog, Jill is walking to the park. Premise 2, Jill is walking to the park. Therefore, John is riding his bicycle. Now, is this argument valid or invalid? Well, you can use the truth table for spoog to figure out whether the argument is valid or invalid, and also to see why. So, let's consider how the truth table would go. Right. This is the truth table again for spoog applied to the case that we're considering. Well, premise 1 tells us that John is riding his bicycle. Spoog, Jill is walking to the park. So, if premise 1 is true, then we're either in this scenario, or in this scenario. Premise 2 tells us that Jill is walking to the park. So, if premise 2 is true, then we're either in this scenario or in this scenario. Okay, so what do premises 1 and 2 put together? What do they tell us? Well, premises 1 and 2 tell us that, first of all, we're not in this scenario, because in this scenario, it's not going to be true that Jill is walking to the park. Again, premises 1 and 2 put together tell us that we're not in this scenario, because in this scenario, it's not going to be true that John is riding his bicycle. Spoog, Jill is walking to the park. Again, premises 1 and 2 tell us that we're not in this scenario, because in this scenario, it's not going to be true that Jill is walking to the park. So, if premises 1 and 2 are both true, that tells us that we've got to be in this scenario. But in this scenario, it's got to be true that John is riding his bicycle. And so, using the truth table for spoog, you can figure out that this argument is valid. And you can explain why it's valid. See? So you can use the truth table for a truth functional connective that you don't have any understanding of independently of the truth table for it, right? It's not a connective that you use in your language. You can just use the truth table to figure out that a particular argument is valid. Let's try that with a more complicated case. Okay, so now suppose you hear some member of this foreign culture arguing as follows, at least according to your translation. John is riding his bicycle. Spoog, Jill is walking to the park, or Frank is sick. Frank is not sick. John is not riding his bicycle. Therefore, Jill is walking to the park. Okay, now is that argument valid or not? Okay, so let's look at this more complicated truth table. Okay, so premise 3 tells us that John is not riding his bicycle, so that tells us that we've got to be in one of these 4 scenarios. Premise 2 tells us that Frank is not sick,
So that tells us that we've got to be in one of these 4 scenarios. And premise 1 tells us that John is riding his bicycle, spoog, Jill is walking to the park, or Frank is sick. So that tells us that we've got to be in one of these scenarios right here. Okay, so based on that information, what can we figure out? Well, we can immediately figure out that we're not in one of these top 4 scenarios, because in all of those top 4 scenarios, Frank is riding his bicycle, right? So premises 1, 2, and 3 together rule out the top 4 scenarios. We can also figure out that we're not in scenarios 5 or 7, because in scenarios 5 or 7, Frank is sick. So we can rule out those scenarios. And we can rule out the sixth scenario, because in the 6th scenario, it's not true that John is riding his bicycle, spoog, Jill is walking to the park, or Frank is sick. So, based on the information that we get from premises 1, 2, and 3 of the argument, we can deduce that we're in this last scenario. We've got to be in this last scenario. And in this last scenario, it's false that Jill is walking to the park. In other words, Jill is not walking to the park. But that's not what the conclusion of our argument says. So this argument, this more complex argument, is not valid. And we can prove that, as we just did, using the truth table for spoog and disjunction. Okay, now let me show how we can do the same thing with quantifiers. So imagine, as you're translating this foreign language, you hear a word. It's always said in a high-pitched tone, an excited tone, jid! And you wonder, what does jid mean? Well, after watching the way they use that word, you come up with a hypothesis. Your hypothesis is that when they use the word jid, they're using a quantifier. And the quantifier works like this. When you say jid, F or G, you're saying that there aren't any F that are outside the G category, but there is an F that's inside the G category. So this diagram represents, according to your hypothesis, this diagram represents what the members of this foreign culture mean by jid. Okay, so now, suppose you hear one of the members of this foreign culture give the following argument. Jid, giraffes are herbivores. You translate it. Then they say, jid, herbivores are mammals. And then they draw the conclusion, there are some giraffes, and all of them are mammals. Now, is that argument valid? Well, let's use the Venn diagram for jid to figure out whether or not it's valid. So the first premise says, jid, giraffes are herbivores. So, how do we represent that? Well, remember, we have to shade out the portion of the giraffe circle that's outside the herbivore circle, and we have to draw an X that's in the giraffe circle and in the herbivore circle. We don't know quite where to draw that X, so let's hedge our bets right now and draw it over here. Okay. The second premise, though, tells us that jid, herbivores are mammals. Now, how do we represent that? Well, remember, by the Venn diagram, we have to shade out that part of the herbivore circle that's outside the mammal circle and draw an X inside the herbivore circle that's also inside the mammal circle. Right, now we know that this X that we drew on the edge has to be inside the mammal circle, not outside the mammal circle. Okay, so we're going to put this X right here on the edge of the mammal circle and the giraffe circle because we don't know specifically which one it's supposed to go into. Oh, but wait, we do. And here's why we do. Remember that when we drew the X on the border of the mammal circle and the herbivore circle right here inside the giraffe circle, we weren't sure if that x was supposed to go in here or in here. Now we know that this x is supposed to go in here. So maybe there are also herbivore mammals that are not giraffes, but what we can definitely conclude from premises 1 and 2 is that there are herbivore mammals that are giraffes. So we know that there's an x that's supposed to go in this region right here. There's an x in that region right here, and then this whole region is shaded out. There's nothing in this whole region. Right, that's what we know from premises 1 and 2 using the Venn diagram for JID. Excuse me, for JID. Okay, now let's apply that to our argument. Well, what does our argument say? It says there are some giraffes and all of them are mammals. But that's exactly what we can read off from the Venn diagram that we just constructed. Right? If you look at the Venn diagram that we just constructed, there's an X that's inside the giraffe circle and inside the mammal circle, and every part of the giraffe circle that's outside the mammal circle is shaded out. So there aren't any giraffes that are not mammals. Okay, so we just figured out that this argument is valid. And we figured it out even though our only understanding of JID was from the Venn diagram that we constructed. Now, I have another question. Given this Venn diagram, how would you translate JID into English? Well, often people use the word all to mean the same thing that JID means according to this Venn diagram. People speaking ordinary English use the word all to mean precisely this quantifier. Right? When they use the word all, they often mean that there are things in the category that they're modifying by all. Like if I say all ravens are birds, often what I'm understood to mean is there actually are some ravens, and all the ravens there are birds. So there are some things in the F circle, but they're all inside the G circle. There are some things in the circle of ravens, let's say, but they're all also inside the circle of birds. There are no ravens outside the bird circle, but there are ravens inside the bird circle. That's often what people would understand me to mean if I said all ravens are birds. Now, we've been using the quantifier all, we've been understanding the quantifier all in a different way, so that it doesn't imply that there actually are members of the category that's being modified by all. So the way we've been using the quantifier all, if you say all ravens are birds, all you mean is there aren't any ravens that are not birds. But that's not the same as saying there are ravens and all of them are birds. So it looks like we can use the Venn diagram for JID to translate that quantifier in a foreign language into a familiar quantifier from ordinary English.
In Unit 2 of this course, in our study of the rules governing the validity of deductive arguments, we've looked at other ways of representing information, other ways besides sentences. We've looked at representing information using a truth table or using a Venn diagram. Now today, in this final lecture of Unit 2, I'd like to talk about the advantages of these other ways of representing information. What's the point of using truth tables or using Venn diagrams? Why did we learn these techniques? And that's the topic of today's lecture. Okay, so let's consider some different ways that we can represent the same information. Consider, for example, this list of 7 sentences. Here's 7 sentences. They all represent the very same information. They all mean the very same thing. They just say the same thing in different languages. One is in French, one is in Italian, one is in Spanish, and so on. But even though they're in different languages and they look different, they all express the same information. They represent the same information. Well, similarly, just as we can use different sentences to represent that information, we can also use something that is not a sentence at all to represent that information. For instance, here, we can use a truth table to represent the very same information that we were representing by means of those different sentences in the previous slide. So look at this truth table for a moment. Now, first column of the truth table is the proposition Walter likes bourbon. The second column of the truth table is the proposition Walter likes vodka. And the third column is the conjunction of those two propositions, which could naturally be expressed in English by the sentence Walter likes bourbon and vodka. And now what we can do once we have this truth table here that shows how the truth or falsity of the conjunction depends on the truth or falsity of each of the conjuncts, we can circle a particular line of that truth table to indicate that this is the situation that we're actually in. Okay, now when we circle that particular row of the truth table, what we're doing is expressing the very same information that we expressed using one of these 7 sentences earlier, right? There's no difference in what information we're expressing, what information we're representing. We're just representing it without using a sentence. We're representing it by circling a row of the truth table. Okay? So it's just a different way of representing the same information. Now you might wonder, well, what's the point of representing that same information in different ways? Well, the point of representing the same information using different sentences in different languages is just that you can make yourself understood by different groups of people. Right? You can say it in French to make yourself understood in France. You can say it in Spanish to make yourself understood in Spain or in Latin America. You can say it in Russian to make yourself understood in Russia, and so forth. So what's the point of using the truth table? And there's no country where they speak truth table. So what's the point of using a truth table to express the very same information? Well, the point is that by using a truth table to represent the very same information, you represent that information in a way that makes very clear exactly what deductive arguments that use that information are valid and which ones are invalid. So for instance, by looking at this truth table, looking at our representation of the information that uses this truth table, we can see very clearly that the argument from the premise, Walter likes bourbon and vodka, to the conclusion, Walter likes bourbon, is going to be a valid argument. There's no possible way for the premise to be true while the conclusion is false. Right? If the premise is true, then the conclusion is also going to have to be true. But we can also see that the deductive argument from the premise Walter likes bourbon to the conclusion Walter likes bourbon and vodka is invalid. There is a possible way for the premise Walter likes bourbon to be true while the conclusion Walter likes bourbon and vodka is false. So, by looking at the truth table, you can see very plainly why some deductive arguments that involve the proposition Walter likes bourbon and vodka are valid, and other deductive arguments involving that same proposition are invalid. And that's something that you can't see just as clearly by looking at any of the 7 sentences that we can use to represent that information. So these sentences have some advantages as a way of representing the information that they all represent, but they all have a disadvantage relative to the truth table, which shows us plainly why certain arguments that use that information are valid and others are invalid. So that's the advantage of using a truth table to represent information that could be represented more naturally by means of sentences. It's not that we make ourselves understood by more people when we use a truth table. It's rather that when we use a truth table, we can see relations of deductive validity that we can't just see when we use sentences. Okay, now, how about Venn diagrams? Well, consider again a piece of information that could be represented using any of these 7 sentences, right? One is in French, one is in Spanish, one is in Italian, and so on, right? All 7 of these sentences mean the same thing. They express the very same information, and they represent it, even though they represent the same information, they're useful in different situations. You might use one when you're in Russia and you want to be understood by Russians. You might use another when you're in India and you want to be understood by a certain population of people in India. You might want to use another when you're in Brazil or Portugal and you want to be understood by Portuguese speakers. But notice, none of these sentences represent the information that they represent in a way that makes it completely clear which deductive arguments that use that information are valid and which are invalid. Okay, we can make that point clear by representing the same information using a Venn diagram. First, we construct a circle to represent the category of Walter's drinks. And second, we construct a circle to represent the category of imported things. And since these 7 sentences all say that all of Walter's drinks are imported, we can then shade out the part of the circle representing Walter's drinks that's outside the circle of imported things, right, to show us that if Walter drinks anything, then whatever it is that he drinks must be imported. It must be inside this region here. Okay, and now we have a Venn diagram that represents the very same information that was represented by those 7 sentences. But what's the point of representing this information using a Venn diagram? Well, the Venn diagram shows us which deductive arguments that use that information are valid and which are invalid. So for instance, consider the argument from all Walter's drinks are imported to all imported drinks are Walter's. Is that argument valid or invalid? Well, if you just look at the sentences, it might not be obvious whether it's valid or invalid. But if you look at the Venn diagram, you can see quite clearly that this argument is invalid. For all of Walter's drinks to be imported is for this part of the Venn diagram to be shaded in. But for all imported drinks to be Walter's would be for this part of the Venn diagram to be shaded in. And the question is there some way for the premise to be true while the conclusion is false? And the answer is clearly yes. This part of the Venn diagram could be shaded in, even if this part of the Venn diagram is not shaded in. And so this is an example of how we can use the Venn diagram to show very plainly and visually why certain arguments that use the information all Walter's drinks are imported, certain of those arguments are valid and certain of them are invalid. Again, so the point of using a Venn diagram to represent information is in that respect very similar to the point of using a truth table to represent information. When you want to understand whether a particular deductive argument is valid or invalid, sometimes it helps to translate the information in that argument into a form where you can plainly see the relations of validity or invalidity, into a form like a truth table or a Venn diagram, where you can plainly see those relationships, because ordinary language doesn't always expose those relationships. Okay, so that's why truth tables and Venn diagrams are useful devices for understanding whether deductive arguments are valid or invalid. And there are many other useful devices like that, but truth tables and Venn diagrams are the two simplest ones, and so the two that we focused on in this course. Okay, well, have fun with the quizzes and have fun with the rest of the course. See you next time.